I guess Ben is going to propose today, thought Kate, and stretching with pleasure, she rolled over on her stomach and raked the pillow that still held the scent of her departed lover and buried her face in it. She knew she was so lucky. And how could she not be happy when your boyfriend was a handsome sheriff's brother who promised to fulfill the dream of American life for you in a house in a respectable suburb behind a white picket fence with 3 kids and maybe a pet Saint Bernard? Ben had promised that everything would happen. He would soon save enough for them to move into their new and shared home. Her parents, Kate thought lazily, had never dreamed of such a thing at her age. They, who had won a green card in the 90s, had come to the United States with literally 2 suitcases and high hopes instead of seed money. A math teacher and an engineer. They were willing to work hard and stubbornly pursue their goals. But it wasn't that simple. 3 times Anastasia and Vincent found themselves on the verge of bankruptcy. They had to live in a trailer park eating out of a food bank. They had to humiliate themselves and take things from charity funds for their daughters. His mom still never tired of repeating how much it hurt her and her father's pride, but they survived. They rose to a confident middle class and now lived on the West Coast in a small house on the coast. Memories of her sister came to mind acutely, suddenly, and at the same time. So naturally, Kate sat up on the bed and shook her head, groaning unhappily. All right, that's enough. On this wonderful morning, she would not think about the past. Enough. But the past, no matter how hard she tried to run away from it, didn't want to let go. And it hurt Kate to imagine what her parents were still feeling, because losing a daughter was, of course, a much more horrible experience than losing a sister. Maggie's been missing for 5 years, missing under circumstances that simply did not allow for hope that one day she would be found alive. And yet, Kate and the girl's parents believed, desperately, with anticipation in every moment for the first 2, with a wistful hope that there was room for happy miracles in the world the next year. In the 4th year, their faith was based on guilt, that they, as kinfolk, simply had no moral right to think Maggie dead until the body was. And then, as the 5th year went on, everyone realized it was time to come to terms. Maggie, their bright, kind, pure girl, was just gone. It was as if she'd been cut out of the world, removed, and that was the end of it. Okay, that's enough. Feeling like she was going to burst into tears if she continued to lie like this, Kate hurried out of bed. Tuck her in. Ben is accustomed to strict order. In fact, he had a thing about keeping everything on a ruler and neat and tidy to the max. It wasn't that Kate had been bothered by it, but now, of course, she was thinking that when she became Miss Kane, she would have to work hard to keep the house in order. What order? Even Ben's cans of beans and other canned goods in the kitchen cupboards had to be labeled in the same direction. Matthew, Ben's brother, had once delicately hinted to Kate that this was not a mental disorder, but rather a psychological problem that a 30-year-old forehead had no reason to fight. I won't, Kate replied cheerfully. I'm not without sin myself, she added with a smile, and Matthew grinned back and nodded. He knew that Kate was hysterical about snakes, hated clowns, and could change her clothes 10 times to choose what to wear because she was in one outfit or the other, but she thought she had a bad figure. It hadn't gotten to the point of moving in with Ben, so Kate had to make do with the clothes she'd picked out of what she'd hastily thrown into a small bag, and she'd chosen a denim skirt and a pink t-shirt with a picture of a unicorn chewing gum. It was probably 30 degrees outside. She thought unhappily as she opened the windows in the living room and kitchen for air. She decided to do a big cleanup. No, Ben hadn't asked her to do that, but she decided to surprise her lover by showing him what a hostess she was. Ben had said yesterday that he was going to the supermarket for his monthly big shopping spree, but when he got back, they'd have half a day free. Perhaps, thought Kate, sweeping the kitchen floor, they could cook dinner together. That would be so romantic, something Italian. Seafood pasta, perhaps. Mrs. Kane, Kate said aloud, as if tasting her future last name, plumping up the decorative sofa cushions in the living room. She took a keen look at her surroundings. No, he was a good guy, a clean and orderly man, albeit a little manic, but it would be to her advantage as a hostess in the future. And then Kate remembered what Ben had said about taking down the guest room closet. He didn't get many guests, so he used it almost as a storage room, for example, for his inflatable boat, and what was going on in the closet. There were boxes of old high school and college awards, more old photo albums, and I don't think there were even boxes from some moving day that hadn't been thrown away. Ben had bought this house 5 years ago, and before that, he'd lived in rentals. Anyway, Ben had said he was going to clean out the closet because he couldn't get enough of this mess, but he'd never gotten around to it. And Kate could imagine what a constant, so to speak, background torment it was for someone like Ben. "Wow," Kate said, opening the doors of the massive, obviously antique closet in the guest room. "You could set up store on the couch in here." Ben had said it was time to give the old stuff to charity, and Kate, sneezing a couple of times from the dust, began unloading winter and denim jackets, hiking boots, board games, some old vases. Just think. And a bunch of all this stuff Ben had had to carry with him when he moved away from his parents. He told her once that his mom wouldn't let him go anywhere without all those important things she thought he'd need someday. "And if we have a garage sale, we'll be millionaires." Kate giggled, looking at the pile of stuff on the floor. Now it all had to be sorted. Just sorted neatly into categories and then let Ben decide where to put it. But before that, she decided to wipe the inside of the closet clean of dust. Done and done. Armed with a rag, she began to rub the crossbar, shelves, side and back walls, and ouch, Kate exclaimed when the back wall crunched at one point under the pressure of her hand, shifting sideways. Kate was afraid she'd broken something. Not that Ben wouldn't forgive, he would understand. He'd been so clumsy himself at times. Just last week, he knocked over a mug of coffee on his brand new laptop. The previous laptop, by the way, ended its life in the same way. And for such clumsy adventures, by the way, coupled with his tall stature, Ben got the nickname Moose in high school. His brother Matt had given him that nickname, by the way, when he came to visit. Kate gingerly touched the wall again, checking to see if anything was broken. Suddenly, the wall slid away smoothly, like a closet door, and behind it there was a dark opening. Catherine frowned. What was it? Some kind of hiding place? She stepped right into the closet and looked inside. There was not much light, but it was clear that it was a tiny pantry. She fumbled with her hand on the wall. Was there a switch of some kind? And a moment later, a light bulb flashed under the stream. Kate blinked. It was indeed a pantry, but an unusual one. Later, there was a table and a chair. On the walls hung maps and some photos. Photos of many people, streets, houses, cars. Catherine frowned. What is this? There was also a rack filled with boxes and individual things, a balloon with artificial snow, a teddy bear, a statue of a reindeer, and there was also a rack with things on hangers. Catherine shook her head and frowned harder. Why make a closet behind a closet? Ben was certainly a weird guy, but this was too much even for him. And why did she feel so uncomfortable in this place? It was as if she'd invaded something that wasn't meant for her and generally prying eyes. And why did it suddenly feel so creepy in here? The girl realized that she was reminded of such maps with photos on the walls, marked with multicolored buttons, and in some places connected by threads. She had seen such things in movies and TV series of detectives. Yeah, her consciousness told her a maniac might have one of these in his lair. But Ben is certainly not a maniac. Kate resented her own thoughts. Why would she even think such a stupid thing? Maybe, well, it's just a hobby of his, strange like the rest of him, and she'd better get out here and spend the day as if nothing had happened, in the company of her favorite man. And then, if she had the chance, ask him, honey, I found something curious there. Tell me what is it and why. Aha mentally grinned at suspicious part of Catherine's mind, which she had already made trouble more than once in her life. And then Ben would close his strong arms around her neck and bury her curious in the past. But now, breathless carcass in the backyard. All right, that's enough. It seemed to Kate that the closet was getting very stuffy, and she turned around and wanted to get out, but her eyes caught the things on the hangers and she froze, slowly and heavily, as in a nightmare when you move and your limbs feel like they're stuck in thickened air. She approached the hanger and pulled one of the things. It was a scarlet silk dress with large white polka dots, a flying silhouette. It looked like it had come out of a fashion catalog from the early 50s. No, it couldn't be her. Kate's brain seemed to desperately refuse to believe what her eyes were seeing. The same dress? No, it couldn't be the same dress. It's just similar. But her hands were already reaching out to check the hem, and there were the initials MP embroidered there. Kate's knees trembled, her mouth opened, but she made no sound. Her sister had a habit of embroidering her initials on things in her closet. How much she had joked about this silly habit of hers and asked why. Why do people sign books in their home library? Maggie answered. So the clothes become all mine. 5 years ago, Maggie disappeared, and people who last saw her said she was wearing this very dress. Her favorite. Catherine's fingers frantically fumbled with the delicate silk, as if it could all dissolve, disappear, revealing only a deception, an illusion. Because to believe it was too frightening, too incomprehensible, too confusing, too crazy. And then Kate suddenly noticed a hole on the side of the dress, at waist level from the back. Here it was torn, and here it was stained with something. She brought the material closer to her eyes and shrieked softly, strangled, brown color, as if dried blood. "Hey, honey, I'm back." Ben's voice came from far away, as if from another world. Honey was quick to put the dress back on the rack, leaping out of the closet, sliding the false wall door back into place. Kate frantically started throwing things back into the closet. Hurry, but in time. Hi, Ben stood on the threshold of the room, looking surprised. "What are you doing, sweetheart?" "I'm just." Tate faked a smile and hoped he didn't see it as the shocked falseness of a man who'd learned too much. "I thought I'd help you sort things out. You talked to me. Remember that you wanted to clean this place up." "I remember," Ben grinned. "But you shouldn't have done that. There's so much junk in here, you don't want to waste a nice day like this. But I appreciated it. Come here, baby." He beckoned to her. "I stopped at the bakery and picked up some of your favorite raisin buns." "Great," Kate squeaked and followed. In the kitchen, she didn't know how. But she made coffee for herself and Ben, her hands shaking a little, but he didn't seem to notice. Kate devoured the muffin, as if she'd been starving for 3 days. "I love it when girls have good appetites." Ben winked at her and Kate almost choked. No, it was a great compliment, of course, because then you wouldn't expect your boyfriend to take you to the gym one day and put you on green smoothies to lose weight. But Maggie had the best appetite of the two sisters, and her parents had even told her off more than once for being so pudgy at 17. But Kate thought it looked great on her. Ben was talking about something, about how he and the boys had gotten a barn from a farmer who was a co-founder of a small construction company. How old Stu had gotten his hound line pregnant again, and now he was running around fostering puppies. And the local vet was scolding him again for being irresponsible because he should have spayed her in time. Maybe. "Is everything all right?" Ben touched her arm affectionately, and Kate shuddered, jumping up in her chair. "I'm sorry," Ben sighed. "You don't seem like yourself today." "No, it's okay," Kate assured him with more fervor than she should for natural behavior. "I just had a bad dream. Nightmares from the past." Kate went to the sink to rinse the dishes. In fact, she dreamed a wonderful dream. How she and Ben came to visit her parents, and she had 3 children, and everyone had a picnic on the beach, and Maggie was with them, alive and well, and apparently sensing her mood, though he misinterpreted her tense reticence, didn't inquire further, and instead talked about what they should do today. At the same time, the couple sorted through the rest of the shopping they'd brought from the supermarket. What needed to be frozen, Ben put away in the fridge at once. And Kate, casting glances at Ben, thought about one thing. How well did she know the man? Or it would be more accurate to say, how well does she think she knows him? Ben Kane, 29 years old, born in Idaho and moved here to New York State right after he graduated from high school. Moved here to be closer to Matthew, who, by the way, is his half-brother on his father's side and with whom Ben has never hidden it. He has always gotten along better than with his parents, and deliberately didn't go to college. Although, according to Matthew, he had a chance, especially if he had gotten a sports scholarship. But Ben, from the age of 12, as they call it, burned to work with wood and, as a result, made a hobby a profitable business. Ben was never married or engaged, and how many girls he had before her, Catherine did not know and did not want to know. But she could guess. A brutal lot. Because Ben, although Ben could seem at first impression of a guy modest, shy, a kind of provincial simpleton, in fact, possessed stunning charisma and some just animal magnetism, thanks to which after about 5 minutes of acquaintance people were ready to talk to him on the heart and generally believe, it seems, in everything he says. So they met in the city of Chicago, where Ben came to some important exhibition of construction devices, and Kate worked in a coffee shop there. Actually, she graduated from college as an advertising specialist. She should have been sitting in an office, but somehow they haven't hired her yet. Why? Well, this was such a mini black streak for a young graduate with no work experience, and she had to live on something, so she became a waitress. Salary with tips was just enough to rent an apartment in a remote area of the city and eat burgers and noodles from Chinatown. Fancy clothes, beauty parlors, Fridays at the clubs, and all that good stuff. Forget it, miss. This place was all about surviving, because it would be unthinkable to drop everything and go to my parents. Not that they wouldn't accept a daughter who'd run aground in life. But Kate didn't want to disappoint them more than anything else by turning up on their doorstep a loser for nothing. They'd had enough of one disappointment in their lives. Her sister. That's why Kate never considered her parents' house on the coast as her own. And even when they, selling their common house, in which they raised their daughters, offered Kate her share to give cash, she courageously refused these tens of thousands. And the parents, by the way, although they hid it, but it felt, were glad, and Catherine was glad for them. They are, if you look in the conventional sense, their duty to fulfill the parental duty. Raise their daughters, and then, well, it was time for each of them to go to an independent, adult life. And how bitter it was to realize, despite the past years, that Maggie had not had time to fly fully into this adult life from her parents' nest. It was bitter to realize it until this morning. And now Catherine had fear sitting in her chest as if embodied in a piece of ice with sharp edges. Maggie's dress. In Ben's secret storeroom. How did it get there? Hey, baby girl. Ben loomed over his fiancée and reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. So what's wrong? You don't seem the same. Well, it's just... Kate smiled softly and pressed herself against him, rubbing her forehead against his muscular chest, her head barely reaching his armpits, hiding her face because it seemed that he could read everything on it. Sorry, I'm just tired at work, and lived outside the city and farther away from the usual Chicago suburbs. In fact, it was already on the outskirts of one other small town that wasn't far from the countryside. And this was where Kate had come for the weekend for the umpteenth time. I got a call from work saying I had to come back right away. The coffee machine was acting up and we bought a new one, some kind of Japanese wonder. Kate's lies came out of her mouth like hail from a weather cloud. And there's a trainee, and they say they have to fire him because he's a total slacker. They're going to hire a new one, and he has to be trained. And I'm already, an old-timer there anyway. It looks like I'll have to leave today. When she had finished, Catherine looked up at her man. Liar, Ben smiled, and his palms pressed her face against her cheeks, then smoothly and inexorably down to her neck. You're such a liar. Did you think I wouldn't find out you were climbing where you couldn't? Well, that's it, sweetheart. Now you'll know how I punish naughty girls. Your sister was just like that. You want to know what I did to her? Hey, baby. Ben's finger snapped in front of her nose and Kate blinked confusedly. She'd imagined the nightmare scene so vividly that she'd lost touch with reality. Sleeping on the move again. You're obviously overworking in this coffee shop. Ben smiled warmly. Her native, cozy and kind giant named Ben had no idea what she had done, and Kate suddenly felt so guilty for her horrible fantasies. Yes, he had her missing sister's dress hanging in his closet, but there had to be some logical explanation for it. Oh, how she wanted to burst into tears and just ask Ben to explain, that he would tell her the truth, and everything would be fine again, like a year ago, like a month ago, like this early morning. But instead, Kate nodded and promised to take more care of herself. And then she went and gathered her things and left the house and got into Ben's pickup truck. He drove her to her small town station as usual, from where the bus she needed was due to leave in the afternoon. And when Catherine left, Ben looked at the bus for a long time. And then he decided that since he had come to town again, it would be good to visit his brother, and since his girlfriend had left, maybe he should sit down with his brother in the evening, have a glass of lemonade because they were both sober, and talk about when Matthew would decide to build his own house. After all, his wife was 4 months pregnant. If they started now, they could probably finish the house before the baby was born. No, Ben did not understand his brother, who was comfortable living in rented accommodation. But Matthew had always been stubborn, and he could only hope that his wife, Sarah, would talk some sense into him. Matthew accepted the invitation and added that in such an evening, it was necessary to have a good time, especially since his wife was visiting her parents at the ranch, which meant that he would be bored at home alone. The sky gradually lost the colors of the sunset, replaced by inky blackness. And now it seemed that from here, from the back porch of Ben's house, you can observe all the stars of the universe. The brothers talked about building a house, and yes, Matthew said he didn't mind, but he couldn't stand the rush. and first he and Sarah had to figure out what they wanted, what kind of layout they wanted, how many stories, and the location mattered. Sarah loved to garden, so the plot had to be chosen carefully. "Well, you'll know by your 50th wedding anniversary," Ben grinned, and then choked on his lemonade as his brother elbowed him in the ribs for joking. "When do we expect your first anniversary?" "I don't know," Ben sighed. "You know, I've been asking her that for a long time, but I'm afraid I'll scare her off. You know, modern girls are very independent, and she hasn't even started her career yet. Maybe she wants too much." Ben squinted. "Well, in principle, I advised her that despite all those excellent grades at uni, it would be better not to be shy to start small, and they'll give her a chance to prove herself. But I'm afraid she doesn't realize that it's not so easy to get a good position right away." Yes, Matthew shook his head. "You've always had a knack for picking the difficult girls. And this one." He stopped talking, taking a sip of lemonade. "You mean that she's her sister?" Ben broke the silence. Matthew nodded instead of answering. He knew all about it. He'd known from the beginning. And it wasn't to say he hadn't tried to stop Ben. He had, but then kinship brotherhood had taken over. And from then on, Matthew wanted nothing more than to keep Ben's secret life from getting so that no one would find out, and that he keep himself in line sometimes. Because, let's face it, in recent years, it's become downright dangerous. "You know, sometimes I wonder," Ben fidgeted on the porch. Would she understand if I told her everything? "Don't even think about it." Matthew put his hand on Ben's shoulder and squeezed his fingers lightly but firmly. "I'm sorry, there are too many people involved in this already. No, and no, believe me. Some secrets are best never told." "I get it," Ben said, his head down. "It's just that sometimes it's like I feel lonely. Believe me, it's better that way than, well, you know," Matthew waved his hand uncertainly in the air. "You know, sometimes I wish I could lock you up. Because, Ben, you're almost 30. Some things, you know, are only good when you're young, when your blood is running wild, and all that fire and foolishness is getting in the way. Anyway, do you promise me that you're in control, that you won't say anything to her?" "I promise," Ben smiled broadly. "Relax, will you? I realize that Kate is a very nice person, but she's not the kind of person I'd tell about what happened to her sister. Not now, that's for sure." "I agree." Matthew sighed contentedly, uncorking a new bottle of lemonade. "Otherwise, we'd have to kill her." Back in Chicago, Kate, of course, didn't go to the coffee shop and instead got to her apartment as soon as possible. And there, barely crossing the threshold, powerlessly sank to the floor and covered her face with her hands, silently sobbed. She was trembling nervously. She could hardly feel her body, and the world around her seemed little real. No, and no again. This couldn't be true. Her Ben could not be the monster who had taken Maggie's life, who had ripped the most precious thing from their family. However, how else was one to understand the fact that it burst like a burst bubble in a swamp where rotten air lurked, that he kept her sister's dress, tattered and with red-brown marks? Having roared to the point of hiccuping, Catherine scraped herself off the floor and went to the bathroom, where she splashed ice water in her face for a long time, and then, having taken off her shoes, collapsed on the bed and fell into a heavy sleep. And it was no ordinary dream, and not a fantastic sort of nightmare. It was a dream memory of the time before everything had happened, of the shaky time when their family had been together and happy, or as if happy. "You're crazy." Kate watched Maggie spin around in front of the mirror. No, her sister looked amazing in this outrageous outfit. A mini dress of rich red color, embroidered with gold sequins, held on thin straps and with the back open to the waist, through which the dress was decorated with gold chains. The image was completed with stiletto heels and bright evening makeup with Egyptian eyeliner. "Your parents will never let you out like that," Kate said, but her voice was full of admiration and envy. She wouldn't have let herself wear it, or even try it on. "I don't care," Maggie winked at her reflection. "I'm an adult, and I can do what I want. You're only 17, but you're 19, Miss Boring, and you're going to finish college without going to a single party." Catherine just shook her head. Yes, Maggie was right about something. She sometimes felt so disconnected from the fun college life. But on the other hand, how could she think about such silly things instead of studying? That's not how her parents raised her. It's not the way they raised Maggie either. Except it didn't work on her. Maggie, unlike Kate, had grown up to be very bold, sharp-tongued, and uncontrollable. She couldn't, like a good girl, come home at 9 o'clock and not a minute later. She didn't study only for top grades, and yes, Her mother literally cut her skirts of inappropriate length and short tops with scissors, but Maggie managed to get money for new ones somewhere. No other way to save money for school lunches, and she was also working part-time, of course. Handing out flyers, a secret Kate kept. In general, Kate was sad, because it was because of Maggie recently in the house fiercely sounded scandals. Sometimes it seemed at all that Maggie was deliberately looking for an occasion. Or maybe she wasn't. And often, by the way, Kate was on her side. She, for example, thought it was cruel to make Maggie eat an empty celery omelet for breakfast because she supposedly needed to lose weight while the rest of the family ate bacon and pancakes. But the harsh fact was that Kate was usually on the sidelines. No, she could sympathize with Maggie, but then secretly, because, what would happen if she dared support her sister in front of mom or dad? Then they'd both be dead. Yes, the fact that Catherine was now in college did not change much for her. For her was still important words of support and guidance from her parents. She still, when she came to visit on vacation, her heart sank if something did something wrong and her mother has not yet said a word, but just threw a stern look. That night, Maggie still sneaked out of the house, and Catherine until the morning tormented by guilt and inability to say that, no, her sister is not sleeping peacefully in her room. She went out with friends. And in the morning, when Maggie returned, Catherine was sick with excitement. She was just sitting down to breakfast, and Maggie, satisfied like a cat that had eaten a tub of sour cream, stood and listened to her mother reprimand her. And she could see in her eyes that she was not a bit better in her ugly behavior. And she cast conspiratorial glances at Kate, and it made her so unbearably gregarious. And then, one morning, Maggie did not come down to breakfast. "She's gone," Mom said. "Where?" said Kate, yawning sleepily and pouring milk over the cereal in her bowl. "Night school. A private boarding school, where her behavior will be monitored," Dad said. This came as a complete surprise to Catherine. No, she'd heard something like that. Maggie had said her parents threatened to re-educate her and swore she'd never ever go. "Well, we just talked," Mom continued, "and we decided it was best for her." She agreed. "I see," Kate shrugged. "Why didn't she say goodbye?" "I didn't want to wake you up," Dad said. Catherine shrugged again and sat down to breakfast. She had enough to worry about, after all. She was about to go back to college, and she was already preparing for it hard. She had stayed up late last night and then fell asleep as she had never slept before. Only in the morning something woke her up. I think something dropped downstairs. Probably her father was watching the game late again and accidentally knocked a dish with salted nuts off the table, for example. Kate went back to college, and the whole private school thing was forgotten. But she wondered how Maggie was doing. After all, it was so unusual for her to go to some closed institution, practically, according to her parents, a boarding school for noble girls, like those about which English writers wrote in the 19th century. And at first Kate thought that her sister wouldn't last a month there. She'd go home, well, or expel her. As it happened before, more than one school changed Maggie for her antics. But time passed, said parents reported. Maggie was studying. Everything was fine. No, she wouldn't come on vacation. It wasn't supposed to be, but they saw her once every 2 or 3 months and everything was fine. And then, on the very day Maggie finally turned 18 and had to leave the walls of the school, she disappeared. It was known that she took a bus, but then she got off at a small station for some reason near a town. She had no friends there, nothing, and no one there that could explain this strange act. But it happened. And then, according to eyewitnesses, Maggie simply walked off down a path leading into a national park, or disappeared into it without a trace. The police officers in charge of the case said that although there were no direct signs of violence, but probably the sister was the victim of some crime and the chances of finding her alive one day, almost minimal. They also suggested that she might have gone mad. True. It seemed personally unbelievable to Kate. Yes, Maggie's behavior was not a gift, but she was smart, and even if she was a crazy person but not crazy. Patron didn't notice how she fell asleep, and when she woke up, she found that, first of all, it was a new day, and secondly, that the whole body was so stiff that you could hardly move. The girl sighed, a night of reflection. Even though she had slept most of it, had helped her make the right decision. She needed to go to the police. "You'll have to wait," said an officer named Martin. "The detective will be here shortly, but my opinion is that it would be better if you contacted the department that is handling the case." I'd have to go to another state, Kate said. And he's here. I understand your logic and your situation, Miss. Martin shook his head. But you better sit down, okay? Have some water. I don't need water. Lighting time dragged on agonizingly slowly. But at last the right man arrived. Detective Jerry was a man of African-American descent, about 50 years old. He was dressed in a strict black suit with a white shirt, and the only bright detail was a bracelet on his left wrist, unusually colorful for his image of a law enforcement officer. My daughter gave it to me, he explained, as if to justify the paltry piece of thread. She was into weaving, and now everyone was wearing it. He smiled, but immediately became serious again. So, let's go over it all again in order. Catherine told everything. And then she was shocked when Jerry told her that there was no way they could go to Ben's house right now and question him. And there's no way to go into his house. You see, we need a warrant to search his house, and it's not going to be easy to get one just from you, he said, as if embarrassed by his own helplessness. But I can send a request to the local sheriff so that he, so to speak, starts to understand the situation. Jerry also said that, theoretically, it was possible to get a warrant, but even for a simple conversation with Ben, they'd have to find out where he was at the moment of Maggie's disappearance. And then, unless they had clear evidence, they wouldn't be able to. Evidence? Kate exclaimed. What proof do you need to believe me? I saw it with my miss. Don't worry. Jerry made a soothing gesture with his hand, as if urging Kate to sit back in the chair from which he had jumped up. And please don't take this personally, but we've already had, unfortunately, situations where, because of a rift in a couple, one of the partners said that the other, are you saying that Ben and I had a fight and I'm deliberately bad-mouthing him? Kate couldn't get it all out of her head. The fact that she was seen as a hysterical fool and the fact that the U.S. police refused to help her, and she had heard so many good things about them. They were such heroes in the movies. Well, I guess I should go, she said, holding on to the crumbs of her personal dignity to keep from crying. Jerry said they'd be sure to gather as much information about Ben as they could, and they'd contact the detectives who'd been investigating Maggie's disappearance. He also advised Kate to stay away from Ben for the time being, just in case, and especially not to ask him anything on her own, because if she was right after all. Catherine, thanking for the help and advice, left, except that she was not going to do what she was told and realized. She must figure out everything on her own, and when she brought and shoved her sister's dress under Jerry's nose, he would only have to agree with her. It was going to take time to get it right, though, as the workdays at the coffee shop were starting, and it would be a few days before she could be at Ben's house again. And how hard that time was for Kate. But she held on. She had time to think about everything, and a whole plan had matured in her head. And so, a few days later, having finally agreed with Ben that she would go back to his place this weekend, Kate was on her way home to pack a few things. She was tense, but she tried to calm down, for Ben was not to guess anything. Kate was so absorbed in herself that she didn't notice the car at all. It was an old car, a white and gray van. It had shown up a couple days ago and had been parked outside the coffee shop where she worked for almost a day, and then it was parked outside the building where she rented an apartment. And certainly, immersed in her worries, Catherine didn't feel a pair of evil, hating eyes following her. "Bad, dirty girl," said the man lurking in the shadows of the alley. He raised his hand and rubbed his neck nervously. He always sweated profusely when it was time not just to watch a girl, to hang around her, or even pretend to be close to her, but to prepare to reveal his true nature to her. "Oh, you bitch." The man exhaled and bared his yellowish teeth in a grin. "You'll find out from me soon enough." When they met, Ben hugged Kate and told her he was happy that she had decided to spend the weekend with him instead of in the stuffy city. "We could go to the lake and go boating," he suggested. "How would you like that?" "I wonder," Kate smiled, and even kissed him. If she was going to play her part, she was going to play it to the fullest, so that he wouldn't suspect a thing until the very end. And before, by the way, Catherine did not realize that she had such acting skills. "But first, a romantic dinner," she added. "I found a recipe and I want to surprise you." So, Ben sighed, stretching, and in that lazy yet powerful movement, he looked like a wildcat. "I have to go to the store, or will canned beans and a piece of beef stew." "Actually," Kate faked a pout, "I need shrimp, spinach noodles, and parmesan." "Okay, baby," Ben grinned. "Oh, what are you doing to me? Before I met you, I would have had less. I'm teaching you manners and nutrition." One is lucky to have such a smart wife. Ben gave her a playful kiss goodbye. And when the door closed behind him and the engine roared a couple of minutes later, Kate almost burst into tears. It turned out to be incredibly difficult to deceive her favorite man, who suddenly turned out to be a maniac. For some time the girl stood, clenching her temples with her fingers. And then she went to the room with the closet. It was time to act. When Maggie was going out with her friends, she didn't think it would end like this. No, of course, she realized that her parents would be furious, but she also knew that their anger had its limits. When the girl got home between 3 and 4 in the morning, she unlocked the door with her own key, and taking off her shoes, she was going to sneak upstairs like a mouse. If she was as lucky as possible, they probably wouldn't know she hadn't been home at all, or they'd start a scandal right away. But this morning, of course, they gave her a scandal. And Maggie listened patiently to the reproaches, and as if even learned them. But just a couple of days later, she again decided to leave the house. Now she was going to a neighborhood party. She went downstairs quietly, and the clock, by the way, was already 11 o'clock in the evening, but suddenly a light flashed in the living room. Maggie blinked, squinted. Her mother and father stood before her. Their faces were tense, and the next thing Maggie noticed were strangers. 3 closets of the most gangly kind. Mom, Dad. She wanted to ask, what's going on? Who are these people? But then the men rushed to her and the nightmare began. One of them gagged her with a rag. The other one put her hands behind her back and tied her wrists with something, immobilizing her. And then the first one threw her over his shoulder like a sack of potatoes and carried her out of the house. Maggie squealed silently and resisted helplessly, as best she could in the situation. But what could she do? Only stare with widened eyes at her parents, who were watching all this calmly, maybe with a tinge of sympathy, but they certainly weren't going to save their daughter. By some miracle, Maggie managed to free herself from the gag, by which time she was already in the car. "No, what are you doing? Help me." But she was pinned down again. She was held tightly by a big man, and naturally a 17-year-old girl was no match for him. A needle flashed in the other man's hands, and Maggie felt a prick in her arm, after which a sickening weakness quickly spread through her body. She realized she was losing consciousness, and then the car started to move. She didn't know how long they drove like that. At times she seemed to regain her senses, but then she slipped back into a disgusting, viscous, and as if tart sleep. "Mommy," the girl called softly and began to cry. She asked for water. She whispered pitifully, humiliatedly, that she had to go to the toilet. But they told her to shut up and only gave her a second injection. Maggie didn't understand what was happening, just waited to see what she was. Well, probably about to be killed, and then the car stopped. She was carried out in her arms. The walls flashed, the corridors were gray. She was thrown onto a hard bed, and the restraints were finally removed. She lost her senses again. Catherine had already plunged into the bowels of the closet, dumping out its contents to reach the back wall, when suddenly she heard the sound of a car pull up. Her heart skipped a beat. It was Ben back. He must have forgotten something. She flew out of the room. If he'd forgotten, he'd take it and drive back. Except the car in front of the house wasn't Ben's, it was his brother Matthew's. "Oh, hello." Catherine smiled so big that her lips ached. "Ben's not here. He's at the stack." When the girl had been in Chicago on the police force, she had wondered if she should have gone to Matthew first, but she'd been scared for a moment. They were brothers. What if he wouldn't believe her either? But now she felt a wave of confidence. If she showed him the creepy closet, Matt would have no choice but to believe her. "I have to show you something." Kate blurted out and grabbed the sheriff, who was clearly stunned, and dragged him into the house. "I'm sorry. I know you love Ben, and I did too, but you have to help me. We have to stop him." "What?" Matt mumbled. "What are you talking about, Katie?" He'd mangled her name in the American way again, but if it had pissed her off before, it didn't matter now. There were more important things to do. There. Now, Kate flew into the room in a mini hurricane and rushed to the closet. Here, this is where he kept his trophies. She slid aside the false wall of the closet, opening the pantry, turned on the light and froze. Stared, because the pantry was completely empty. No maps on the walls, no pictures, no belongings, and the dress was gone too. Catherine slowly turned back around to Matthew, because she heard something, a quiet chuckle. And now she saw it, a grin on his lips. And Kate broke into a cold sweat at the realization. Matthew knew everything. He knew who Ben really was. Hey, new girl. No. Someone gently shook Maggie's shoulder. Wake up, come on. She groaned pitifully, struggled to get her eyes open, and in her first instinctive movement, jerked to the side and immediately banged her head painfully against the wall. She rubbed the back of her head. Maggie realized where she was, in a room. 2 beds, 2 chairs, 2 small tables. A closet, too, all furnished very simply. There were windows, as if there were windows, but they were closed and you couldn't see outside. On the edge of her bed sat a girl, a little younger than her, it seems, dressed in a gray suit. Skirt, jacket, and shirt. No, what? Where am I? What's going on? You must be thirsty. The girl asked sympathetically, holding out a glass of water, and Maggie greedily drained it. My name is Angela. I was kidnapped. Maggie sobbed. No, so was I, Angela sighed. I don't remember anyone ever being brought here willingly. Well, unless they tricked their parents into saying it's just a school. Now, what are you talking about? Maggie didn't understand, but something was starting to come to her mind, bits and pieces of it. A reform school, Angela said. A private institution. Or a camp for troubled teens. No, my parents. Maggie shook her head. Let me guess. Angela squinted. You've probably heard them talk about how you need to be re-educated, right? Or maybe they even told you they should send you to some boarding school, only once or twice. I didn't think. No, they couldn't have done that. They could. Angela cut her off harshly. Believe me, they could. It costs a hell of a lot of money to study here. So your parents thought very carefully before they sent you here. I want to leave. No. They signed papers saying they trust us to be our guardians until we come of age. Angela waved her hand. It kind of becomes the school and its staff. How long do you have to stay? I'll be 18 in 7 months. Lucky girl. I'm still only 16, but I was an honor student in high school, and here. I don't know if they'll let me graduate before the others, or if they'll marinate me until I'm of age. Okay, I gotta get you cleaned up. With these words, she went to the closet and came back with a set of clothes, the same as her own. Go wash up and change your clothes. Do you have any piercings? She asked sympathetically, and Maggie shook her head in the negative. That's good. Or they could have ripped it out, and it was unclear whether Angela was joking or telling the truth. Come on. You'll soon be taken to the principal. He'll tell you about the rules here. We'll live together. The curriculum is normal. Well, almost. Girls aren't allowed to play sports here, but they teach us cooking and obedience, and there are also chastity lessons. Well, don't pay attention. The most boring ones you can fall asleep on. The main thing. Angela put her hand on Maggie's shoulder. To be obedient. And be patient. Believe me, one day we'll get out of here. Except Maggie wasn't ready to be patient or obedient at first. She couldn't understand how her parents could do such a thing. So she was brought to the principal's office and told him they had no right to keep her here. One more word and you'll go to the punishment cell, doll. Yes, said the principal, a full, bald-headed man puffing shamelessly in the presence of his ward cigar. What the hell are you doing? Maggie shrieked, jumping up from her chair. This is America. It's a free country, and I'm a free citizen of it. You have no right. I'll sue you. You'll pay me $1 million for what you're doing. And this is Utah, doll, the director grinned. But his eyes now looked at Maggie in a way that sent a chill down her spine. And believe me, with a little good parenting, you'll never tell anyone anything, ever. You think you're the first one who's ever been a hound? Believe me, we've had hundreds of kids go through us. And we've returned them all to their parents, a different person. Security. The director shouted in a bass voice and added, when strong guys in uniform burst into the office. Put the little shit in the punishment cell. 48 hours, just water and some pig food. Maggie had been in the shoe for 24 hours. Dark, cold, empty, a concrete box. She came out, choking on tears and snot, and begging for no more torture. But after 3 days of seeming submission, but in fact intimidated submission, again began to rebel. In general, Maggie, though she did not seek it, but quickly gained some fame among the inhabitants of the closed school, because she was punished more often than others. And only one person surpassed her in this, a boy named Roger. He, too, was 17 and had been sent here after his father's death by his stepmother. Sometimes it seemed as if Roger was deliberately seeking punishment just to annoy his near prisoners. "You can't break me anyway. I'll roll you into a scone and throw it down the Gooston," laughed as the two men dragged him to the holding cell. This was witnessed by Maggie, who was just being dragged out of the punishment cell. She also saw that one of the men had a bruised nose, and Roger winked at her, saying, "Look how tough I am." The boys and girls lived in different buildings, but they studied in the same classes, and gradually, somehow unnoticed even by themselves, Maggie and Roger developed a special bond. They could exchange glances that were imperceptible to others, and that were so telling to themselves, at times at nightmarish risks, they even managed to pass notes to each other. But still, no matter how brave Maggie was, and as time went on, she began not that she was breaking down, but somehow ashamed of her position. Her parents had visited her only 3 times during her time at the school. The headmaster had assured them that too much contact with her family was detrimental to the educational process. And Maggie, she could not explain to herself why it was so, but only at the meeting with her parents she spoke as if she were reading a piece of paper. Yes, she was studying. Yes, everything was good. Yes, everything was normal. However, these meetings were always in the personal presence of the principal and a couple of other people, including Mrs. Lillian, the person in charge of the punishment system. That's why Maggie kept her mouth shut. She was afraid her parents wouldn't believe her, and she'd get it when they left. Only once, 2 months before graduation, on their last visit, did Maggie make up her mind. She silently lifted the sleeve of her jacket, showing the red marks on her arm. The marks from the straps they'd tied her with in the hospital when she dared to deliberately poison herself with some berries. Just enough to make her nauseous, give her a rash, and allow her to skip classes. Her parents rounded their eyes, and Maggie was about to open her mouth to say, "Help, I'm being tortured here. Can't you see that?" But the principal intervened. He'd noticed too. "I have to apologize," he said, and he looked like a man who could be trusted. We didn't look after your girl. During the riding lesson, she got her hand tangled in the reins. We were afraid she would break everything. I understand if you want to take her away immediately and terminate the contract, as well as sue and demand moral compensation." "No, I don't." Maggie's mom shook her hands. "Your school has such good reviews." "No, we won't." "They're teenagers," she smiled. "They're always getting bruises and scrapes, aren't they?" Maggie's father only told her to be careful and sternly remarked that that's why she'd been sent here. To keep her safe, because she'd behaved so badly in the past that she was asking for trouble. Then her parents left, and Maggie was punished. One day she was going to meet Roger, secretly in the garden behind the school's outbuildings. But he didn't come. But instead of him came a girl, red-haired Maggie, who, by the way, was here because she had allegedly done something to the new wife of her millionaire father. So, once again, it was the evil stepmother's fault. It was on this basis, the similarity of life's hardships, 13-year-old Maggie, and became a loyal friend of Roger and played for him, and Maggie the role of liaison, passed notes and verbal messages. "They've taken him away," she whispered the news. "Where?" Maggie was frightened. She might have believed, given Roger's insolence, that the headmaster would decide to get rid of him altogether. "I don't know." Maggie looked around apprehensively. But in the middle of the night, a motorcade came. Some people showed the headmaster some papers and took Roger away. "Anyway, he's gone. And he didn't tell me anything." Maggie asked. "Actually, there is something," said Maggie uncertainly. "He said to just wait. That one day it would be. What's that supposed to mean?" "I don't know," Maggie said. It's all very mysterious." Maggie spent the rest of the time before graduation in an extremely depressed state. So depressed that her mentor's torturers even began to think that perhaps she had finally come to her senses. And Maggie, without any additional coercive measures, on the eve of graduation, in the principal's office, with her own hand and under his dictation, wrote a letter of thanks to her native school, where she described how nice it was to live here and assured that she had no claims and undertook not to disclose any information. And then the girl put on her favorite dress. Her parents had given it to her. She left the school and took the bus. She was supposed to just go home, but suddenly she got off the bus, and after that she disappeared. Catherine, looking at Matthew, realized the meaning of the expression about the soul going to the heels. "What is it?" Matt looked into the pantry closet with feigned surprise. Well, the house was old and Ben didn't need it, so he decided to block it off with furniture. And the closet, by the way, belonged to the previous owners of the house. There are even documents for that. So, oh, Katie, he clucked his tongue. I'm afraid we'll have to have a serious talk about everything. Catherine swallowed hard. Something told her that the conversation would not be pleasant, and that it would be even worse when Ben returned, grabbing the lamp. It was an antique with a lavender shade. Kate didn't think that it was dangerous to hit someone on the head like that, and then, with a short swing, hit Matthew in the temple, and when he fell to the floor, shrieking and clutching his head and face, she ran out of the room, run out of the house. She had come in Ben's car, which meant there was no way to get away from here. Catherine's gaze lingered for a moment on the sheriff's car, but she quickly realized that it was a bad idea, even if she managed to get the keys off Matt's belt when she got back to the house. I wonder, she thought, if he was there, alive at all. But immediately the girl rushed to run. No time to think and linger, we need to save ourselves. Fortunately, there was a road nearby. It was not the busiest, but yes, there were cars passing along it. Kate stood on the side of the road and waved both arms vigorously. May please, somebody stop. She pleaded to no one as a couple of cars sped past, for some reason, not caring about fellow travelers. But then a car pulled out from somewhere off to the side, around a bend that split the large roads into many small roads. It was an old white van, but one that seemed to be kept in decent condition by its owner. It slowed down beside Kate. Good afternoon, miss. The driver, a stoutly built man of obscure height, for he was sitting now, touched the brim of his baseball cap with his fingers and smiled, flashing his eyes behind the thick lenses of his glasses. Need to go into town, yes. Kate blurted out and almost immediately did not spill everything, that she was fleeing from the house of a maniac and his accomplice, and at the same time brother and sheriff, please. And you? Are you in Greentown? She wondered if her destination was the small town where Matt was sheriff. Kate had no doubt that if she showed up there, she'd be arrested in 5 minutes at the most on the orders of Matt, who'd certainly come to his senses by now for some far-fetched reason. And there, she'd be trapped for sure. Actually, I have to go to Chicago. Kate licked her lips nervously. I can pay. It's no big deal. The driver dismissed her. Actually, that's exactly where I need to go. In a hurry, he asked as Kate climbed into the car and fastened her seatbelt with trembling fingers. Then I think we should take a shortcut. And he turned the car abruptly on the empty road and speeded off in the opposite direction. That is, to the country road from which he had come. But the fact that it was very strange to go back in, that the road to Chicago was in a completely different direction, somehow did not immediately reach to Catherine Simpson. I know all the roads here, said the driver as if reading her confused and, alas, too late thoughts. You have no idea how many young fools vote like that on the roads in the middle of nowhere, and they believe, silly girls, that a good guy will stop next to them. The driver suddenly chuckled, and looking at Kate, wetly smacked his lips. Only I, my girl, am not a good guy at all. The girl's hand was fumbling for the car door handle, and her gaze was stuck to the man behind the wheel. He slowed down, and Kate still had time to think, and how he was not afraid of losing control. But he apparently didn't care, because he was distracted by the fact that from somewhere under the seat he quickly extracted a dirty rag and a vial, wet it, and then pressed it to the face of her companion, who hadn't even had time to scream. Kate threw up her hands, but he was stronger, one hand on her neck, pressing forward, the other with the rag blocking her nose and mouth. A strange, acrid odor hit her sense of smell, and it seemed her very brain, and then Kate, before she could even taste the feeling of overwhelming terror, fell into darkness. He'd seen her a long time ago, and he realized at once that she was an extraordinary girl, not at all like the girls he had seen before, and certainly not like those ordinary girls. It was an overcast, cold day, when it seemed as if all of Chicago had fallen into gloom. He went into a coffee shop to get a latte and a sandwich on special offer because he was used to saving money. Yes, perhaps that was his second problem after lack of female attention, lack of money. How he had envied all those rich bums, gold-digging dumb guys and gals in his youth who didn't appreciate what they had and squandered their money. Unlike them, he knew the value of every cent. He grew up in a simple working-class family. His father, however, began to drink a lot towards the end and raised his hand at home too often, more often than they all deserved. And Jim, already at the age of 6, realized, by the way, that his father beats him not just there, and for the cause, whips him with a belt with a heavy metal badge, not for malicious intent, but because he wants him to grow up to be a decent man. Jem, already at the age of 8, stopped sticking up for his mother when his father attacked her with fists, because he realized that his father does not do it for nothing. His mother is probably guilty too. Jem was never an excellent student, but he managed to get a scholarship and went to college. He quickly realized what he wanted to be: a teacher, to instill knowledge and truths about life and the world around him into the heads of youngsters. And 15 years of work flew by like a day. True, at work sometimes there was trouble. Among the pupils there were sissies who were snotty. They complained, and Jem was reprimanded for his allegedly not pedagogical methods. Hey, what did they know? Jem was convinced that he never punished anyone for nothing, and in general he was still too soft. And then when he was well into his 30s, he was invited to work at a boarding school designed to rehabilitate troubled teens, and Jem rejoiced. At last his talents found a use for them. At last he could do anything he saw fit. Well, almost everything, because there were of course rules, and he wasn't crazy enough to break them and get in trouble with the law, not at all. But even if he eventually reached the principal's chair, above which there was only the board of trustees, which owned this school and a few others scattered in the most loyal states of America. But Jem realized one day it's not enough for him. And then his first time happened. Exciting and unforgettable. Just one day, Jem picked up a girl on the road. They talked, and she bragged that her parents forbade it. But she still ran away from home to go to the concert of her favorite rock band. A dark flame flared up inside Jem. He realized that this young fool needed to be taught a lesson. And looking back later, at first, he was horrified. How had he gotten so far? But then he realized, no, he hadn't gone too far. It's just that some lessons for bad girls have to be just that. There's no fixing them. Can't reeducate them. But it's his duty as an educator to teach them one last lesson. The realization of his own great mission in this world helped him quickly get rid of the fear of being caught, exposed by the police. But like that first time, Jem was no longer in a hurry. Now he chose his victim in advance, looked closely, learned everything about her, and only then proceeded to the educational process. And now on his way met her, Catherine. She smiled so warmly, handing up the order, that he first thought that here, what a pure, sweet girl, a young woman in the prime of her splendor. But then, when he had already moved away from the counter of the cafe, he suddenly heard her talking on the phone. The harlot. She was talking to a guy and going to his place for the weekend. Jem hadn't noticed the ring on her finger. He felt as bad as if he'd been punched in the solar plexus. It was a deafening, bitter disappointment. But Jem realized that there was a world full of immoral girls like that. And he could, in principle, forget about this blonde girl, on whose badge was written the playful name Katie, but something did not give him peace. It took him a few days to find out and realize what it was. He remembered that the parents of one of the girls had shown him their family photos, and there was a picture of Katie. Then Jem put the two together and realized it was the sister of that naughty girl named Maggie. He'd heard the fool had gone missing, but he'd had absolutely nothing to do with it. But now he had a new goal, and he began to plan and wait patiently for the right moment. And now the moment had come. The sky was covered with low, gray clouds. Jem staggered a little, carrying his burden. His back was a problem, and his age was making itself felt. All the men in his family aged early. Exhaling from the strain, he finally set it down on the grassy bed. Then he threw off his backpack and sat down beside her, unzipped it, and started unloading all the necessary things. The forest was quite deaf in this part. There were no hiking trails because it was close to the protected area, and Jem liked to bring silly girls here. Catherine moaned softly and moved. Her head ached. There was a nasty taste in her mouth, and it seemed that her whole body was stiff as after a long sleep. The picture in front of her eyes was blurred, fuzzy, but as it cut across her consciousness, when she saw the man leaning over, What are you doing? No, please. The words came out of her mouth in a weak stream. She didn't know exactly what was happening yet, but she knew it was something very, very bad. She tried to stand up, but she couldn't. Her legs and arms were entangled in plastic ties. It was lucky, she thought, that her hands were tied at the front and not at the back. Otherwise, she would have looked like a beetle tipped on its back by a nasty predator. "You're Maggie's sister," Jem said, not asking, just stating the fact. "Maggie, you." The thoughts in Catherine's head were running fast and confused. but she understood something too well. No, I didn't kill her and I don't know who did, Jim said before a scream escaped the girl's lips. I suppose I should introduce myself. He smiled, took off his glasses and put them in his pocket. Without them, of course, you could see worse, but Jim had always felt a little inferior in them, ever since a tough kid in high school had nicknamed him Four Eyes, and for asking him not to insult him, had rinsed Jim's head in the toilet to the laughter of his classmates. I'm the principal of your sister's school. I was entrusted with such a beautiful flower. That girl had so much potential, but she took a bad path, and you, her older sister, are the same. He smiled sadly. But, do you know what my secret is? Me, please, sir. Catherine did not know how to behave with maniacs. Who would even think about such a thing in advance? But somehow she felt that pleading would not get through to him. Let me go. I won't say anything to anyone. My secret is that I'm not only a talented teacher, but also the author of my own methodology. With these words, Jim twirled something sharp and shiny in his hands. Kate's throat constricted with choking nausea because well, you didn't have to be an expert on crime stories to suppose that this something sharp and shiny was going to be used on you. Helpless and sobbing, sprawled on a forest floor somewhere in the wilderness. Meanwhile, Jim, in colors, vividly described the essence of his methodology. And Kate, meanwhile, stopped crying because she was absorbed in pure, somehow primal horror. She simply realized that there was something in front of her that had little to do with being human. And she was far from the first to be here, in this corner of the forest near the cliff, the outline of the top of which resembled the face of a grizzly. They're here. They're the other girls. Long dead, fresh and hidden shallowly. And she, according to Jim, it was just under 24 hours before she joined them, which Kate realized with horror promised to be excruciatingly endless for her. As Matt began to come to his senses, he discovered two things. First, a frail, petite Katie had a lot of strength to stun him like that, albeit with a lamp, and he was clearly losing his self-defense skills, and he had been an excellent student at the police academy. The second was his brother's concerned face leaning over him. Well, what's wrong? Katie found your stash, Matt said, managing to suppress the sweary adjective. And I told you he'd be trouble if anyone ever found out. Now see him. But what are the odds that someone's going to be poking around the back of someone else's closet? Ben mumbled, helping his brother to sit up as he moved his senseless body to the living room couch and handed him a bag of frozen broccoli. We should get you to the hospital. It'll wait, Matt said, hissing softly as he applied the ice pack to the injured area. She ran away, obviously thinking we were a couple of psychopaths, a maniac and the sheriff covering for him. She could make a lot of noise. She's already contacted the Chicago police, by the way. No. What? Ben's eyes widened. When? Why didn't you tell me? I just found out myself this morning. You know, a little birdie told me. Actually, they don't know much about your story. How did they take it? They thought it was a jilted girlfriend getting back at her boyfriend, that's all. But the fact is, now don't be surprised if they start looking at you. No, don't talk nonsense. Ben snorted, rising from the couch. He used both hands to tussle the hair on his head, which had already grown back into a mound of coal-black curls, and paced the room nervously. I must find her and talk to her. Tell her the truth. I agree. For the first time, Matt said with a sigh, lengths and cities, a brainstorm started when Ben was a 16-year-old boy. In the backwoods of Idaho, where he was from, entertainment was scarce. And so Ben's family feared that one day the adventurous boy would get into trouble. And so in principle, it happened. One fine evening, Ben volunteered to drive around the land that belonged to his family. They kept cattle, and now it was necessary to keep an eye on how and where they grazed and whether coyotes or others violated the boundaries of the land. When Ben noticed the stranger, he wanted to rush home, warn his parents, or at least the hired help. They were tough guys, real cowboys in the coolest sense of the word, but something did not allow him to realize his plan at once. Some vague feeling. He approached the stranger and realized he was wounded. Ben spoke to him and was shocked by what he heard. It turned out that this guy, who introduced himself as Tom, was supposed to be an important witness in the case against the traffickers of disapproved substances, but the cop's car in which he was being transported had been attacked. Tom said that apparently these villains had informants among the local authorities. Tom was afraid he wouldn't live to see the trial, which was to take place in 3 days in a town that was a long way away, and then Ben made a bold, but at the same time, a reckless decision. He decided that he would become a guide for Tom. The thing was, Ben had lost his grandfather a year ago, and while the old man was alive, he had taught him how to navigate the terrain, survive in the wilderness, and many other things. The old man said that among his own ancestors were bounty hunters and other dashing fellows, from whom he had learned the knowledge that is not taught in modern universities and even in your police academies. Tom doubted very much that the green boy would be a good chaperone, but what else was he to do? He was very much afraid that they would get rid of him. So Ben left home. In general, he lied that to a friend. He supposedly broke his leg and the girl dumped him, and the refusal from the college came. In general, it would be necessary to support. With this lie, he won exactly a day's head start, and there, of course, he was grabbed. Parents were shocked. Moreover, the locals spread the news about the murdered policeman. Rangers, volunteers went to look for Ben. They even sent a helicopter and search dogs. But Ben and his companion could not be found. And then they showed up in that town, right on the day of the trial. Ben escorted a valuable witness, literally, to the courtroom. And naturally, it turned out to be a very big story. Ben was in a lot of trouble. His parents were furious. But the guy found his defenders, the sheriff of his hometown, who by this time had figured out who of his subordinates also worked for the bad guys. "You ought to go to the FBI or the CIA, kid," the old sheriff said, and shook Ben's hand in a mature way. "Don't scold him too much," the sheriff told his parents. "He did something that not every cop has the guts to do. To think of it. He patched Tom up, took him through some wild places, mixed up his tracks. You'll go far." Ben himself, by the way, was shy and didn't want the fame. He refused any interviews, didn't take part in the show. And little by little they got rid of him. And then he moved closer to his brother. And then, anyway, a woman came to him. She'd been beaten by her husband for years. She was afraid to leave him because he had connections, he said. She begged him to help her escape, especially since she was pregnant and afraid he'd take the baby away. Ben helped. He arranged for her to move to a quiet, sleepy little town and arranged everything so that her husband thought she had run away with her lover to Europe in the first place. Then this woman still risked filing for divorce. The child stayed with her, and the scoundrel got a restraining order to come within 100 meters of her. Then something else happened. Ben was approached by the parents of a teenage girl who'd been kidnapped by some cult madman who decided to sacrifice her to the god of chaos. The authorities were looking for her, but they said there was no chance. Because the psychopath had taken the victim into the mountains, Ben wasn't officially allowed to investigate, and he didn't ask for it. He did it all himself. He found the madman and saved the child. In general, Ben didn't plan to deal with such cases. He had enough of his work with wood, construction. But after this case with the rescued girl, the authorities contacted him and offered to become, so to speak, a freelance specialist who could be called upon for help as needed. Now, Ben was called upon when there was a need to escort a person from point A to point B without anyone knowing about it. He consulted on wilderness searches for people and participated in some rescue expeditions himself. And he had one weakness. Sometimes he asked these people for some trifle belonging to them as a souvenir for himself. In general, his, so to speak, official superiors did not approve of this, but Ben in principle trusted, and he could do so. And many people willingly gave him things as souvenirs, because these people were sincerely grateful to him, their savior. And 5 years ago, perhaps one of Ben's most difficult and unusual cases happened. It all started with the fact that a detective who had been working with him for years shared with him some very interesting and unusual information. An investigation was launched into a network of private schools, where rumor had it that they not only taught teenagers and kept them in strict discipline, but also practiced all kinds of abuse on them. Gathering evidence was very difficult. It was extremely difficult to send their people to these institutions under the guise of staff. And then it was decided to try to ask for help from some of the students. Yes, it turned out that it was necessary to involve minors in active and dangerous actions, but there was no other way out. Ben's new assignment was to be a girl named Maggie. He had to pick her up in a small town and then take her to the office of the detective in charge of the case. And at first, it seemed that everything was going according to plan. But Maggie suddenly refused to go anywhere. And in fact, it turned out that another man had already come for her. It was her school acquaintance, Roger. He had been pulled out of school by his father's lawyer, who was also a friend of the family. And now Roger, being of legal age himself, offered Maggie to run away with him to Mexico. And Maggie agreed. She told Ben that she realizes how important her testimony is to the investigation, but she doesn't want to risk her life, because then she would become an enemy to such powerful people. And besides, Maggie just wanted to start a new life after all she had been through. She was very angry at her parents for sending her to this nightmare place. She was convinced that they suspected something about the way she was being treated, but turned a blind eye to it. It turned out that she and Roger had already planned the whole thing. He was ready to arrange everything so that Maggie would be thought to be missing or dead, and then they could start a whole new life in Mexico. Ben was faced with a monstrously difficult choice, for if he agreed with Maggie, then he was betraying the people he was working with. He realized that all of this, it wasn't exactly legal, but Ben agreed to help. He quickly got to know Roger, and the two of them perfected the plan. Ben helped the boys escape through the woods, where Roger's men would pick them up. But Maggie, unfortunately, was inexperienced in the wilderness and fell into some trap set by poachers. She just walked away from the camp into the bushes alone. Although Ben told her not to do that, she bumped her side on a wooden stake, and Ben barely managed to give her first aid. Fortunately, they soon met up with the people Roger's lawyer had helped him hire, and Maggie's life was now safe. And before they parted, Ben asked her to give him the dress. The girl agreed. Ben then pretended he'd lost Maggie. He was believed. And only his brother knew the truth. 4 years went by, and then the authorities found out the truth. They were ready to bring some charges against Ben, but he was a valuable specialist after all. So they just reprimanded him, especially since they needed his help again. The thing was that, first of all, the trial against these private schools was about to start. They finally had enough evidence and testimonies from former students. And secondly, the detectives began to suspect that the principal of one of the schools in Utah and the maniac attacking girls in many states is the same person. And now they were on his trail. Ben was also helping in his search, but even with all his talents, this thing just seemed elusive. More than 10 victims, young girls. And only recently, according to the detectives, did they get on his trail. And now we could only hope that he would be caught before he sent another victim to the grave. "Your phone's ringing," Matt said to his brother. "Would you at least answer it?" And reluctantly pulled his phone out of his pocket. But when he saw the number, he took the call. It was Detective Larry, with whom they had worked closely over the years, and who had covered for Ben with the authorities after Maggie. "No." "What?" Ben exclaimed. "No. Where is he? What do you mean, stay out of this?" "Larry, you owe it to me to tell me." "No. What's wrong?" Matt asked, but Ben didn't react, just glared. Detective Larry, after a moment's hesitation on the other side, finally gave the approximate coordinates of where the maniac could be. The thing was that only this morning the team of detectives had all the necessary versions, data, and so on, and then someone else became known. About a suspicious type who was driving a white van was reported from a local gas station. This guy was asking a suspicious amount about a local saleswoman, a single mother named Sally, and the owner of the gas station thought it was suspicious. And then the police got a call from another person, a truck driver who first saw a girl jump out and wave her arms at the road, hurriedly voting, and then a strange white van picked her up and drove off in the same direction it had come from. Then the detectives compared the description of the van driver with the approximate portrait of the maniac. In general, Larry assured Ben that the right people had already gone to the supposed area of the villain's location. He assured him that, although Ben was a very capable guy, but he should please stay out of the way where the professionals were working, then heard that the girl who got into the van was a blonde in a purple dress and immediately realized that it was his Kate. And now, of course, he couldn't just sit and wait for it to be over. "I'm with you." Matt started to get up from the couch, but immediately sank back down with a groan. He was dizzy. "I'm afraid your fiancé gave me a concussion." "I don't think so." Ben threw open the secret locker in the living room to retrieve his weapon. "You need to go to the hospital." "Okay, I'll call an ambulance," Matt agreed. But are you sure?" "I've never been so sure of anything." Ben said as he ran out the door. "Any last words, doll?" Jim's hot, stinking breath hit Kate's face and she almost threw up. "I'm afraid you'll forget how to talk, not just scream," grinned the maniac. Yes, Kate looked him straight in the eye. She was scared, yes, very scared, but also how much she hated him. She had never realized that it was possible to hate a man so quickly, but it still seemed so natural after he had confessed all his crimes to her. "I hope you die soon." Her hands were bound in front, and it was this that allowed Kate to suddenly raise them sharply, throwing them forward. The plastic tie caught the cold steel that the maniac was clutching in his right hand, and then Kate drove her hand sharply down and away. Jim gave a confused gasp and dropped the weapon. He wasn't used to his victims fighting back. Usually, they just cried and begged for mercy. He was even more dumbfounded when Kate managed to pull his knee sharply up to his chest, and then, straightening her leg, kicked him hard in the stomach. Jim yelped again, bending in half. "You little bitch. Are you trying to ruin my fun?" He roared and fumbled blindly on the ground, looking for what he had dropped. "You can't always be lucky." Kate exclaimed. "You're going to get caught, you bastard. You think you're special. You're a psycho." "Shut up," shrieked Jim, who suddenly lost his sense of superiority, of boundless power, and even the realization of his own important mission in the world. And all this made him very, very sad, and he was ready to take out all this anger on the obnoxious girl, who stood out from the ranks of his victims so disgustingly, as if deliberately decided to disrupt his pleasure. Get away from her. Kate didn't immediately realize whether the sound was human speech or the growl of a wild animal. But then, turning her head, she saw Ben standing on a low bushy knoll, tense and yet relaxed and dangerous, his legs wide apart, his head tilted forward. Get away from her. "Who the hell are you?" Jim shrieked, his sweat pouring down in a hail. He was no longer angry, but shocked that his plans had been so disgustingly spoiled. "I'll get you." "Ben," Kate exhaled and sprawled on the ground without strength. It had just ended abruptly, and then she just watched what was happening. And it seemed to her that she was watching a scene from a movie. The girl was not quite aware of reality. She was like an outside observer. She saw how the maniac threw at Ben and how he deftly dodged his attack. And then the maniac just flew to the ground, and then howled when Ben snapped his arm and something crunched, as if a dry branch had broken. And the next moment, armed men in uniforms flew into the clearing. They were special agents and police men. Kate felt so strange. She was ready to faint again, but she found the strength to smile weakly at the guy leaning over her. "I'm here, baby. How are you? Let's get you out of here." He was already cutting the ties. "No, I'm sorry." It's okay. That's wrong. I guess I was wrong, huh?" Kate whispered. You're a good man, aren't you? You didn't kill my sister," she said. "I didn't ask Ma with certainty. I just don't understand. Her dress, how is it?" "I'll explain," Ben said, and Kate blinked. The image before her eyes was blurring. When she woke up again, she realized she was in a hospital room. The doctor who had greeted her on waking explained that the maniac had knocked her out with a very toxic substance to which she had become allergic, but it had fortunately been neutralized. He also said that she had been in a deep sleep for almost 2 days. "You have visitors," the doctor added. "But I would recommend complete rest. Catherine would like to rest too." But she needed the truth even more. And when Ben entered the room, by the way, with a bouquet of flowers, she, as soon as he approached, grabbed his hand tightly. "Do you know what happened to Maggie?" What's happened to her?" It was strange, but it was only when Ben appeared there to rescue her that Catherine suddenly realized in an instant that no, he couldn't be the culprit. And now Ben had told her everything. He had revealed to her the truth about how he had met Maggie and helped her in Roger's escape. He told her about his secret case and apologized for not being able to tell her the truth sooner. "Are you crying because I didn't tell you sooner?" He asked cautiously. "No," Kate sobbed. But Maggie, how could she do this to us, to her family? Mom and Dad, they thought they'd lost her." "Actually, I'm sorry," Ben coughed awkwardly. But I can kind of understand it. It's kind of hard to forgive your parents when you're stuck in a place like this." "But they didn't know what was going on," Kate ejected stubbornly. "I believe that. I wish I did," Ben said, barely audibly. "Kate, actually, the detectives will have to talk to you soon, and your words will be very important in the case against that monster. Also, anyway." Ben turned to enter the room, and Kate rounded her eyes, because Maggie was standing on the doorstep. She had changed over the years, tanned, had a short haircut, but it was still the same Maggie. Standing next to her was a tall, also tanned guy. "Hello," Maggie said and smiled. "Can I come in?" Kate, sobbing, could only nod. Ben, saying he didn't want to intrude, left the room. There was so much they needed to talk about. And they did. Maggie told how they live now. Roger's lawyer had managed to get him a decent sum from his father's inheritance, with which they had bought a house in Mexico and opened a small restaurant on the ocean. Maggie has already given birth to 2 children, twin boys, and, as she admitted, waiting for another child. "I visited different psychologists," she said, lowering her eyes. "I tried to forgive my parents, to understand them." "And how?" Kate asked quietly. "It's not that easy," Maggie sighed. "I'm ready. I can meet them. Kate, they ruined my life. I don't think I'll ever be able to treat them the way I used to. But I've managed to let go of that pain, and I can see them. I can communicate with them a little bit." Maggie also revealed that she's here to finally testify fully against Jim as the school principal. "You have a wonderful fiancé," Maggie smiled. "And actually, he hasn't proposed to me yet, really." "What's this then?" And her sister pointed to one of the flowers in the bouquet, a scarlet rose with a diamond ring glittering in the center of its bud. Kate, gasping, reached for it. "You can put it back and wait for him to ask you," Maggie smiled. "Or you can just put it on his finger and he'll see it when he comes back. It's up to you. Just don't you dare say you won't marry him." They talked for a while longer. Kate got to know Roger and recognized that he was a very good-looking guy. Then Maggie left. "The doctor says you'll be out in a couple of days," said Ben, who had returned to the room. "You'll probably want to go back to your place. Don't worry, there'll be cops outside your house, and they'll put an alarm system in your apartment and—" He said, "Nah, Ben," Kate said, noticing that he glanced at the bouquet and frowned, because the ring wasn't there. "No, it didn't fall off or get lost," she added, taking one hand away from the other so that it was now visible. The ring was on her finger. I'd like to go to your place. If you don't mind, of course." Ben looked at her dumbfounded for a few moments, and then he hugged her. "I love you so much," he said. And Kate cried again, this time with happiness. Kate would have liked the next few months to be filled with joy, for she had found the sister she had long thought dead and could love and be loved again. But unfortunately for her, the next few months were filled with the formalities of a double investigation. Jim had been charged for all his victims, and for the deeds he had done at the private school. And at the same time, though it hadn't been an easy time at all, it had all somehow brought Kate closer to her sister and Ben. And then, when it was all over, Maggie and Roger, as well as Kate, had gone to visit the sister's parents. There was a difficult meeting. They talked about a lot of things. Their parents swore that they were unaware of all the nightmares their daughter had to endure. And it seemed to Kate from the outside that Maggie had almost forgiven them. Then Maggie and her husband returned to Mexico. "Where are you taking me?" Kate asked, because Ben, when she got back to his place, put her in the car and told her he had a surprise for her. "If I tell you, it stops being a surprise," he replied. "Hey, don't peek," he added sternly when Catherine reached for the blindfold. "Hey, whatever you say," she snorted and obeyed. Finally, the car slowed down. Ben helped the bride out of the cabin, holding her gently under the arm and around the waist, because Kate's eyes were still hidden by the blindfold. "It's okay now," he said, taking it off, squinting in the bright midday sun. Kate looked around at the space in front of her with surprised incomprehension. There was a forest in the background, and in front, there was a foundation and some other beginning of construction. "TMG master, what is this? Did you decide to show off your firm's new project?" "You could say that." Ben grinned. "Look," he pointed with his hand. "Here there will be French windows, and here a veranda, and I also plan—" He described the future house colorfully and clearly, and the longer he talked, the more Kate understood that it would be something extraordinary. "Somebody's going to be lucky," she sighed. Actually, Ben told her, leaning in close to her ear. "If you want, you can add to it, change it." "No." "Why?" Kate didn't understand. "No, silly girl." He laughed. Because it's your house, our house. I designed it for you and me. I bought the lot. Even includes a piece of woods in that stream over there, more like a rivulet, see? And so I decided that when we get married, we need something completely new and the best." Kate turned to Ben and looked at him wide-eyed. This was such an unexpected, generous gift. She had been preoccupied with other things ever since he had proposed, and she had accepted it. And she hadn't thought much about where they would live after the wedding. But now, looking at what was yet to become home, she realized that it would be the coziest and best place in the world for her, the best home she could ever dream of. "No, thank you," she said, and raised on tiptoe and kissed him. I have something to say too. What is it? Ben asked, looking into her beautiful eyes, which had conquered him at first sight. I think it is absolutely necessary to plant a nursery in the house. Ben froze, and then, picking her up in his arms, spun her around. This was definitely the happiest day of his life, and he knew there would be many more happy days to come. For as long as she could remember, Megan had always dreamed of warmth, care, and attention. All this she lacked from early childhood. Megan's mom died of a heart attack when she was about 5 years old. The duration of the ward was forbidden to give birth at all due to health conditions. Doctors warned of the risks, but the woman still decided. The first years of her life, Megan was the most beloved child in the world. She vaguely remembered those times of warm hugs, mom's tender words, and kind smile. But of course, no matter how hard Megan tried, she couldn't remember the details. Mom's face was lost in a blur. And then Megan was left alone with her father, a somber and uncommunicative man. He faithfully fulfilled his parental duties, fed his daughter, bought her clothes, even checked her homework, but any heart-to-heart talk was out of the question. Her father asked only specific questions about her grades at school, her health, her plans for vacations. Sometimes he wondered if anyone was hurting his daughter. Megan couldn't remember if Dad had always been so uncommunicative or if he had been so changed by the death of the woman he loved. Megan had heard from neighbors that her father loved her mother very much. He had long sought the favor of the modest beauty, and then, when Elena married him, fulfilled every wish of his wife. It was hard for Megan to imagine her perpetually dissatisfied father as romantic, loving, attentive. As she grew older, the girl understood. The father blames his daughter for the death of his spouse, accidentally overhearing his conversation with a neighbor. The men were standing in the stairwell, and Megan was just returning from school. The anniversary of her mother's passing was approaching. I guess that's why the neighbors, longtime friends, were having this conversation. I told her to get an abortion, Dad said quietly. But she wouldn't have it. Let it be, she said. She had a premonition that everything would end well. Megan, hearing these words, froze under the stairs. She just couldn't get up right now, thus giving away her presence. Well, it's all good in the end, and it was good at first, Uncle Peter, the neighbor, pointed out. Megan knew her mom was friends with his wife and Aunt Gray. Megan was born. Adeline still had a whole 5 years to live afterward. That's so sad, Dad agreed, but her health was failing, and I could see she was getting worse. And those sleepless nights, I myself tried to get up to my daughter to adult her to sleep, but I could not be there all the time. And those assholes, they finished her after 5 years. That's for sure. Even the doctor confirmed it. Megan was having a hard time processing what she had heard. She hadn't discussed it with anyone. And who would she tell? Her father, as it turned out, considered her the culprit of all his misfortunes, so he probably didn't talk to his daughter much. Megan didn't have any grandmothers, or rather she had one, her dad's mom, but she lived far away in the country. They saw each other very rarely, and of course, warm, trusting relations between them did not arise. And girlfriends. What about girlfriends? You can't talk to them about such topics. They won't understand. They're just fine. Each of them has a mom, a dad. Not all of them do, but mom is the main mom. For so many tears, her childhood teenage years were spilled into a pillow. Longing for a mother the girl hardly knew or remembered. Sadness over the cool and strained relationship with her father. Megan dreamed of growing up sooner, having a family of her own, having children. She had no doubt that sooner or later a man would appear in her life who would love and protect her. And Megan would be happiness for him, a source of energy and inspiration. The father probably still loved his daughter in his own way. He rooted, loved, cared for his daughter as best he could, worried about her future. It was her father who arranged for the girl to go to the University of Economics and Law, and even to the prestigious Faculty of Finance and Economics, connected some connections. And now his daughter, who would hardly have been admitted on general grounds, is a student of the best university in the city. No, Megan was not stupid or lazy. She had always done well in school, and she had always done her homework diligently. But it was just that to enter this faculty required a very outstanding ability. The girl didn't have them, so her father helped her. True, among the girl's classmates, as it soon turned out, outstanding abilities possessed few. So many then got into the university this way, either for money or by blat. Megan liked studying, and somehow warm, friendly relations with her classmates were formed at once. A wonderful student time began. Life had changed a lot. Megan felt that very soon she would become an adult and independent, which means that her dream of a loving family is very close. In the 4th year, fate dealt the girl another crushing blow. She was left all alone. Her father is frowning and not talking, but so reliable. In the shop where he worked, a milling machine operator, a gas cylinder failed, and a fire broke out. There were few casualties, but Megan's father was among them. Then left alone in the whole world, Megan realized that all this time felt the support and love of a loved one. Yes, her father had been that kind of man, unable to express his feelings, not saying much. But now Megan realized it, how much he did for her. About a year, the girl came to herself, got used to the new world without her father, and then John appeared in her life. John was a student at their school, but he was in a different department, law school. He, like Megan, was graduating that year. They met at a lecture in the auditorium, which was common for soon-to-be graduates. Young people were told about the very procedure of graduation, state exams and diploma, introduced young people to possible employers, presented companies that offered jobs to the best and most diligent students. It was interesting. Megan happened to be among strangers. Her friends were sitting at the other end of the hall, but Megan was a little late, and there was no seat next to them. So she had to sit where there were still empty chairs. At first, all the girl's attention was focused on the stage. She caught every word of the speakers, even wrote something down. "Why, Bert?" An unexpected question took the girl by surprise. She turned around and looked at the speaker. A handsome guy was looking at her with a smile. A wide smile, white teeth, correct facial features, and bright blue eyes. They immediately charmed Megan. There was so much interest in them. The girl suddenly felt that she cared about this man. "It's so depressing," he repeated. "And the weather outside is so beautiful. Spring is in full swing. There's a spring flower festival in the park. Why don't we run away?" It was the first time Megan had ever seen this guy. Besides, the lecture was very important and interesting. And after it, Megan and her friends agreed to go to the library to prepare together for the credit on economic theory. But all this somehow suddenly lost importance, and the girl nodded her head in agreement. The boy glowed, as if her answer made him the happiest man in the world. He confidently took Megan's hand and led her away from the classroom. Some people looked at the couple, but Megan didn't care at all. The weather did turn out to be wonderful. The sun was shining brightly from the clear sky, which was softly blue, and the freshness and purity of the greenery had just blossomed. The air was filled with the aromas of plants beginning to bloom. On the way, the young people got acquainted. It turned out that the guy's name was John. He admitted that as soon as he saw Megan, he couldn't take his eyes off her. "You're just incredibly beautiful," he said, looking at the girl. And she, strangely enough, did not feel a shadow of doubt, although always distinguished by modesty, and even stiff. I looked at you for a long time. I dared to talk to you because I was afraid you'd send me away. And when you agreed to go away with me, it was a weight off my shoulders." Megan was pleased to hear those words. She liked John more and more. What if a girl forbade herself to even dream of such a thing, so as not to be disappointed? What if he was the man she would later start a family with? Yes, these thoughts visited Megan at the first acquaintance. They started dating. John turned out to be a reliable, loving, sensitive man. Having learned the girl's story, it was as if he took her under his wing. He tried to help Megan with everything. The guy even helped her renovate her house. And more precisely, he did it himself, almost alone, because the girl did not understand anything about it at all. A little more time passed. The young people graduated from university, and both got a job. Megan became an accountant in a small firm for the installation of intercoms. John went as an assistant judge at the local courthouse. Megan knew by then that John was growing up without a father. His mother had given birth to him at a rather late age. As they say, for herself. She was a powerful woman who had spent her entire life in a senior position at the airport. Even now, at her advanced age, she didn't want to leave her position. John kept trying to introduce Megan to her, but for some reason, the girl was afraid of what if John's mother didn't like her. What then if this woman will be against the relationship of the only son with a girl of the lower strata of society? John laughed at these fears. Mom wasn't like that. Yes, she is used to command, but in everything that concerns me, she gives me freedom and autonomy. I've been on my own for 6 years. She's always worked hard, and I've been at home looking after the household. So don't worry, I'm not a mama's boy, and she's not a monster. Still, Megan persisted in making up excuses not to go visit John's mother. Worried, anxious, dreading the meeting. And then John proposed to Megan. It cannot be said that it was quite unexpected. Relationships of young people have long been strong. Both of them could not imagine life without each other. The girl had no doubt that John was the man she had dreamed of since childhood. He gave her everything that Megan lacked: love, attention, care, tenderness, where she could talk to him about anything. A soulmate. Sometimes Megan couldn't believe her luck. It might not have happened if she hadn't been in the chair next to John at the lecture that day. It was just such an accident of fate. John did everything beautifully, just like in the movies. He invited Megan to a restaurant to celebrate his small promotion. The girl had no idea of the true motives behind the date. Then suddenly musicians came up to them and played a beautiful melody. Megan, flapping her eyes in surprise, looked at the men in white tails. Then a waiter appeared with a gorgeous bouquet of roses. John took it from the hands of the young man and with a smile presented it to Megan, then deftly pulled out of his pocket a velvet box. "Be my wife." John smiled, looking into Megan's eyes. "You are the most beautiful girl in the world. I love you and I want to be with you always." The girl then even had tears flowing from her eyes, so much she was touched. This proposal, it was made so beautifully. John had carefully prepared for the meeting, so much thought. What was happening resembled a scene from a good, though not too original melodrama. The young people began to prepare for the wedding. Both decided that they did not need a lavish celebration, just a party with friends from the university and a restaurant. And yet it was necessary to solve a lot of issues, to book a place in the registry office, to find a restaurant, to think over the menu. And, of course, now Megan had to meet John's mom. There was no point in delaying the meeting any longer. Megan remembered the day she'd first seen Martha. She'd been terribly nervous, but the woman who'd opened the door had seemed to be smiling at her genuinely. Tall, slender Martha looked very stylish in her elegant dress, with her hair slicked back smoothly. A real lady, and she behaved in a very friendly and polite manner. Megan realized at once that John's mother belonged to the so-called cold type of women. Careerist, used to work hard, compete, and achieve their goals. John is the same. He does not wait for heart-to-heart talks, warm embraces. No worldly advice. Martha's not going to be a second mom. And in the role of caring grandmother who spoils grandchildren with pies, it is also difficult to imagine her, but it's all nonsense. Martha caused Megan respect and even admiration. You bet, because she has achieved so much on her own and became a boss and a wonderful son raised. All this alone, without the help of her husband or relatives. After the wedding, began to live in Megan's apartment. Both worked. John received a good salary. Enough even for some excesses, cafes and restaurants, beautiful clothes, concerts, and most importantly, to travel. For 2 years of marriage, Young managed to go to the sea 5 times. Not to luxury resorts with 5-star hotels, but still it was a wonderful vacation. Cheerful, carefree, full of sunshine and warmth, Megan and John together learned to lead a household. In principle, the young wife knew how to do everything. She had been living alone for a long time, but the head of the family had to learn new skills. Although John coped with it quickly and even as if playfully, Megan felt happier than ever. Next to her was a man who understood her half a word. John listened with interest to Megan's news, accumulated during the day, in all situations took her side, and he often hugged his young wife on and off. Megan realized that she had finally met the man she had long dreamed of and mentally thanked fate for this chance encounter. "I wish our Stephen would turn out to be so smart and responsible," what the young father dreamed, rocking his tiny son in his arms. Megan nodded her head. She had slightly different plans for this child. The young mother wanted Stephen to be happy and healthy, and the rest was not so important. You didn't have to be a factory manager at all to feel joyful and peaceful. Stephen did turn out to be an incredibly curious little boy. He was ahead of his peers in many ways. Early began to walk, early spoke. The baby constantly asked his parents questions, was interested in the world around him, trying to understand literally everything. The newly baptized parents did not want the soul in the firstborn. And when he was about 4 years old, John and Megan decided that it was time to give birth to Stephen's little sister. Megan hoped that she and John would have a daughter. She wanted to give this little girl everything she didn't have herself. Pretty dresses, smart hairstyles at the matinee, talking about girly topics, doing things together in the kitchen and all that. But Richard was born, a wonderful blue-eyed baby boy, charming, charismatic, attracting the attention of others. So what's for the daughter next time? John smiled, rocking the stroller. It was their first family outing of the city. Stephen was holding on to the handle of the stroller too. He was so looking forward to his brother, so excited to see him. True, when Richard was brought home from the hospital, he was a little disappointed. It turned out that Stephen had hoped that his brother would be older right away. He imagined a boy with whom he could play catch-up or hide and seek. Time flew by at breakneck speed. It turned out that coping with a couple of little boys at once is not so easy. And then, unexpectedly, Martha came to Megan's rescue. Every day after work, her mother-in-law would rush home, quickly change her clothes, have dinner, and then go straight to her daughter-in-law's house. John was often late in court, sometimes coming in late at night. Megan was exhausted by evening, and it was during this difficult period that Martha appeared. To take care of the grandchildren, she would go out with the little ones to walk in the yard. Sometimes they went further into the park. It was only 2, well, at most 3 hours a day. But how Megan looked forward to them each time. While the kids were away, she had time to clean up, cook something, go to the bathroom, and all in peace and quiet. It seemed like a small thing, but for a young, tired mother, it was a real salvation. How grateful Megan was to Martha. She repeatedly told her mother-in-law about it, and the latter smiled and replied that she herself was happy to communicate with her grandchildren. No, a warm and close relationship between daughter-in-law and mother-in-law had not developed, although Megan wanted it very much. She invited her mother-in-law to tea, tried to start frank conversations, but this woman, she was some too aloof, cold and inaccessible like the Snow Queen. It was either her personality or she didn't like Megan very much. Eventually, Megan stopped worrying about it and accepted the situation as it was. Martha stayed away from her daughter-in-law with advice, reproaches, and moralizing. She showed up when Megan needed her and helped the young mother a lot. Perhaps the woman herself did not even realize how she supported Megan in a difficult period. A little more time passed, the boys grew up. Now both went to the garden, and Megan was finally able to go to work. There was more money in the family. The couple began planning a summer trip to the sea. It was to be their children's first. And then life in the country began to change. Enterprises were closing one after another. That fate befell the firm where Megan worked. The woman was out of work. John's salary began to be delayed steadily, which, by the way, at the new price level was not enough even for the most basic necessities. John was now practically never home at all. After a working day in court, he ran around the city looking for a part-time job. Somewhere to guard a warehouse, somewhere to help unload a truck. The man grabbed every opportunity to bring home an extra. Megan was a housewife now. She was looking for a job in her specialty. She ran to interviews, advertised in newspapers, but there was no result. In the end, the woman couldn't even get a job as a salesman. There was no demand for jobs in their town at that time. Megan was glad that she was able to at least find a job as a cleaner. Now she scrubbed the floors in the entryways of a neighboring house in the early morning while everyone was still asleep. It didn't pay much, but there was a plus side to the job. It ended late in the morning. The whole day was free. Money was scarce. The children were growing at a dizzying rate, and clothes were quickly becoming too small for them. They also needed nutritious meals. This John and Megan could sit on buckwheat or pasta, and the boys need vitamins, meat, fruit, milk. Young spouses were often close to despair. It was Martha who kept them from being completely lost. She was cut down long ago, as she should have been on a well-deserved vacation by age. And just someone needed a warm place, which for a long time was occupied by a firm and principled boss. But Martha managed to save a certain amount of money during the years of work at a fairly high post. She dreamed of buying a small house by the sea where she expected to meet her old age. But circumstances have changed and prices have risen. Now the woman's savings would not be enough for a decent home, and she was not going to buy anything. So Martha used her savings to sponsor the young family every month. Both John and Megan knew if anything happened, they wouldn't be lost. Martha wouldn't let them go under, but at the same time, they both didn't want to abuse the woman's help, so they did their best. It was hard, and yet the feeling of a strong rear end kept them from being discouraged. In spite of everything that was happening, Martha was still unknown to Megan. Her mother-in-law kept her distance from her daughter-in-law, and she didn't hug her son either. But grandchildren are a different matter. Pulling next to them, the woman blossomed. She embraced them without shyness, kissed them, called them affectionate nicknames, and the boys reciprocated. Megan sometimes tried to talk to her husband about it. "Don't worry about it. Mom was always like that." He smiled. "Just a person like that, kind, good, loving. But she does not know how to show her feelings. Maybe it's because Mom grew up in an orphanage. She didn't get love when she was a kid. So she doesn't know how to express her feelings. But she's reliable and she doesn't abandon her own." When John and Megan's sons went to school, Martha took over the lessons. It turned out that she once many years ago wanted to become an elementary school teacher. Then the woman's career took a different path. But now the long-time dream was realized in her grandchildren. Grandmother was inspired by the boys. She knew how to be strict and demanding, but at the same time she emphasized to interest Stephen and Richard, to instill in them a thirst for knowledge, to develop the innate abilities of her grandchildren. While parents tried to get an extra penny and disappeared on earnings, their children did not run homeless in the yard. They were under the reliable supervision of their grandmother, who invested a lot in their development. Stephen and Richard were the best students in their classes. They were also good at sports, because Martha had time to take them to the volleyball section located on the other side of the city. In this sports center, the best coach worked, and Martha did not agree to anything less for her grandchildren. And so they lived, stretched, supported each other, raised their children. And then one day John got tired of working, as the man himself put it, miserable existence. He decided to risk opening his own business. It is clear that the man took the money for the promotion of the business from his mother. And where else? Not by taking out loans from the bank at crazy interest rates. Then the newlyweds had their first son, Stephen. The name was chosen by John, the name of his neighbor, who paid a lot of attention to the boy and became for him a kind of a substitute for his grandfather. He was a respected man, serious, intelligent. He headed a whole local factory for a long time. John bought some technical stuff from a warehouse in a neighboring town, sold it on the market at a higher price, and immediately made a profit, albeit a small one. The success inspired John, so he decided to work in this direction and registered as a sole proprietorship. Megan helped him with the documents. She was an economist, worked as an accountant for a long time, so reporting and primary documentation were completely on her. The couple rented a place in the market and began work. At first, the business was slow. The client base had not yet been built up. Links with suppliers had not been established. Profits in the first few months were either minimal or non-existent. I had to solve many different problems. Sometimes I even wanted to give up, but in the end, the business went on, and the small store earned money. Finally, the family had money, albeit small, but their own. They didn't have to ask Martha for help anymore. John even managed to pay her back the money he had borrowed for the business. Megan knew that her mother-in-law tried to refuse to give this help as a gift to the young family. But John insisted. They flew to the sea after all. The boys were already old enough. Megan watched with what joy they were running along the beach, and her heart sank with delight. What happiness this was. More on that next. John's business grew. Soon the man opened an entire store, then another. Now he had a whole staff working for him, accountants, managers, salespeople. But Megan was given the opportunity not to work and to deal with the house and children. True, the boys had already become teenagers and no longer needed a nanny. But the family moved to a private house, and Megan had a whole garden at her disposal. For its improvement, the woman took up with energy and inspiration. And again she thanked fate for what is happening in her life. The house is a full cup, a loving husband, wonderful, talented children. Every day a reason for joy and pride. And a garden in which Megan felt like a full mistress. Here she felt calm, relaxed, peaceful. The woman believed that her present life was a reward for what she had experienced as a child. She also often regretted that her father did not see how wonderful life was for his daughter. He probably would have been happy for Megan, and he certainly would have cherished his grandchildren. And yet, as time went on, Megan began to realize that something was missing. John had grown distant. No, they still had a wonderful relationship. Her husband was never rude to her, always remembered holidays and their personal dates. Only he was too busy working. He came home late at night, often flew on business trips, literally lived his life. Stephen and Richard are almost adults now. They have their own lives, their own friends, their own interests, and that's fine. It was just a little sad that their sons had grown up so quickly and Megan hadn't had time to fully enjoy their childhood years, too busy trying to survive. Martha remained alien and cold. Such a temperament. Megan probably didn't even know until now how or what to talk to her about. Their only topic of conversation was probably Richard and Stephen. Her mother-in-law had grown old, but she still looked like an iron lady. She lived separately, and she refused to move out of her own apartment, where she was the full mistress, into her son's house. And Megan understood and supported her in this. And in this difficult period in Megan's life, again not happiness. She didn't even believe her feelings at first. She thought she just didn't even seem to allow the thought to be true. But then it became all too obvious. Megan realized she was expecting a baby again after all these years. John seemed overjoyed, but still took the news a little too reservedly. There wasn't the excitement in his eyes that there had been years ago when he had learned of his wife's first and second pregnancies. Wow, so unexpected, he smiled, then pulled Megan close and kissed her. We need to find you the best doctors. We're getting older, you know. Megan understood and was worried too, of course. Being pregnant in your early 20s was very different from being pregnant with a woman in her 40s. There are definitely more risks. The sons took the news of the imminent arrival of a brother or sister positively. Wow, we're going to have a little one. Stephen smiled. It's so weird, but I like the news. It's fun, Richard shook his head. Martha, hearing the news, only shrugged her shoulders. Well, it's unexpected, of course, but it's nothing special. I had John when I was a little younger than you. Everything's going to be all right now. The pregnancy, despite Megan's misgivings, went easily, but as an older woman, she had to undergo more frequent checkups. At the next ultrasound, Megan lay on the cold couch and prayed to herself that the baby would be okay. She, of course, dreamed of a daughter and a long time ago, since childhood. After the birth of her two sons, the wish had been forgotten. And now, when she found out that she was pregnant again, Megan began to hope again, how she wanted to become a mom of a charming girl. The woman chased these thoughts away from herself, convinced that one should be happy with any child. And it was unlikely that after two boys, suddenly such a miracle would happen. Why would it be a girl? Now, lying on the couch, Megan wanted only one thing, that with this child that lives under her heart, everything turned out to be all right. Whether it's a boy or a girl is a matter of 10. Being pregnant with her first sons, Megan didn't know much. Now she had a wealth of information that made her heart clench anxiously and her eyes gaze into the face of the doctor, inserting a sensor across her abdomen to read her emotions. Storina kept thinking the doctor was frowning. How scared she was. Was it really that bad in there? Do you have a girl? Suddenly the man in the white coat said in a calm, mundane tone. A hot wave of joy flooded Megan's heart. She even felt a little dizzy. She hadn't expected to be told the gender so early. And then there was a girl. Was this really happening to her? Had her dream come true after all these years? Is she all right? Megan asked Megan the question she wanted to know. She's fine. No abnormalities. Vivian was born on her due date. Megan had thought of a name for her daughter a long time ago. Back in college, I think. The girl was born a healthy baby and soon became the family's favorite. Martha now came to Megan's house every day to babysit her granddaughter. Once again, her help came in handy. Megan adored her daughter because she had waited so long for her. She had stopped dreaming of such a gift, but sometimes she needed time to take a bath or go shopping alone. And then Martha came to the rescue again. Her time flew by at breakneck speed. Megan knew it was always like that when you have a small child. He's just a helpless little baby. Before you know it, it's already a person with its own personality and hobbies. Vivian turned out to be a pretty little girl. She took after Megan, was the same swarthy, slender, and graceful, but her eyes were her father's, huge, bright blue. They shone on her swarthy, beautiful face. The boys had all grown up. Stephen graduated first. He easily got into the Boston Medical Academy. Stephen must have decided in the 5th grade that he was going to be a doctor. At first, his parents thought it was a frivolous hobby. But as time went on, the eldest son stayed true to his dream. In the end, he entered the medical school, and on the budget. Megan at first was afraid to let the young guy alone in the big city. But Stephen, he was serious enough and independent for such a university. So in the end, his mother had to respectfully accept his decision. A few years later, Richard followed his brother. He, too, entered Boston University, only he chose a different specialty. From childhood, he was attracted to computers, programs, technical puzzles. The sons flew out of the nest. The husband lived a life of work. During this period, Megan realized what a happiness it is that she has a daughter small, beautiful, loved, and loving. She filled women's lives with joy and happiness, made it bright and meaningful. If it weren't for Vivian, Megan would feel all alone and unneeded now. Vivian practiced ballet and the girl was doing great. The choreographers were all saying she had real talent. Megan knew that her daughter went in her. Except that in childhood, Megan did not have such an opportunity to show her gift. Her father, of course, did not take her daughter to a club, but Vivian had succeeded. The girl even traveled with performances in different cities. A real tour, loving, caring mother everywhere accompanied her. It was a bright and saturated life, which gave Megan a daughter. Everything was good, just wonderful. The boys studied and worked in Boston. Megan visited them occasionally. The sons were happy, and that made them happy. John was developing a business that was bringing in more and more profit. Now Karina had a daughter, whose long-standing dream was finally realized. It would seem, live and rejoice. But the woman's heart was increasingly clenched from some vague premonitions. Something was wrong. Megan chased away bad thoughts. She was even going to see a psychologist, but one day, the cause of the vague anxiety revealed itself. Megan had gone to the mall to find a dress for her daughter's next performance. Vivian had caught a cold somewhere in the garden, so Martha stayed with her. Megan went to the mall. The woman was in high spirits. She had managed to find a wonderful outfit for her daughter, and it was just the right size. She imagined how excited her little girl's eyes would be when she saw the outfit. That's when the woman noticed John. She just happened to glance down, going up the escalator, and saw her husband on the first floor in a bright orange shirt, which she herself had given him. It was a stylish shirt with short sleeves, summer, dressy, and elegant at the same time. John liked it immediately, and now he often wore it to work. John wasn't walking alone, but with a young girl in his arms. From afar, Megan couldn't see all the details, couldn't see the stranger's face, didn't have time to estimate her age. But she noticed the main thing. John's hand was resting on the thin waist of the young woman. She, in turn, had her palm in the back pocket of John's pants. John was smiling happily. The world turned upside down in just a few moments. Megan stood on the escalator steps. She considered herself a happy, accomplished woman who had managed to build a strong family. And on the next floor, she arrived already a cheated and betrayed spouse. To gather her thoughts, Megan went up to the food court, settled down at a small table in the far corner of the hall, and ordered herself a coffee. What she had just witnessed, how to explain it? Megan really wanted to find some excuse for what she had seen, but it wasn't working. If she wanted to, she could still convince herself that John was just walking through the mall with a female employee. Maybe they wanted to look at the assortment of competitors or something else. John had his arm around the stranger's waist. Both of them were not embarrassed by the people, who at this time in the mall were plenty. They walked with their arms around each other and smiled as if they were well-off free students. And between them there was clearly a special relationship. It was immediately apparent. Is John cheating on her? It's hard to believe. Almost impossible. But why impossible? Megan began to reflect on her life and realized that she and John had long lived as close relatives, but not as loving spouses. All their conversations revolved around their children and their future. When was the last time they had gone out together? Besides, John was away at work too often, flying on business trips. Maybe it wasn't business trips at all, but traveling with young mistresses. Megan found it hard to breathe, as if she'd been hit in the solar plexus. She couldn't get enough air. Everything was spinning in front of her eyes. Was her happy married life just an illusion? How stupid did she have to be not to see it? Megan decided not to get too excited. She pulled herself together and got up from the table. She'd have to go home and act like nothing had happened. When John returned, she would discreetly take his cell phone and look into his correspondence. Then everything will be clear, and we can do something about it. You need proof. Otherwise, you can fantasize a lot of things. Maybe it's not so bad after all. That night, Megan put her plan into action. She'd always trusted her husband. It had never occurred to her to go through his phone before, and John knew it because his cell phone didn't even have a password. The man had left a phone on the coffee table when he went to the bathroom. He generally assumed that his spouse was already asleep. Megan was awake. As soon as the sound of water came from the bathroom, she slipped out of bed and went downstairs. She grabbed her husband's cell phone, entered his messages, and there was a lot of interesting things. Megan learned that her husband's lover's name was Catherine. She was only 25 years old, not much older than Stephen. Deceived spouse leafed through numerous photos of a young girl. On them, she showed the advantages of her luxurious figure. Incredibly beautiful, daring Catherine was not shy and wrote such things, which rather even think was embarrassing, but John clearly liked it. Apparently, the couple had already had quite a long affair. John was firmly on the hook for the young beauty. They called each other cute nicknames, made plans for a summer vacation. Apparently, the lovers had not the first time traveled together to the sea. It hurt to read this correspondence, but she needed to know what was going on. What she saw shocked her. She did not want to believe that all this was true. The correspondence was also about Megan. Catherine called her lover's wife an old lady. John did not even try to defend his wife. On the contrary, sent in response smiling smiley faces saying it's funny to him. How could this happen to them? They were once the closest and dearest people to each other, two halves of one whole. They had overcome so much together, and suddenly this happened. The sound of the water in the bathroom faded, and Megan hurriedly returned the phone to its place and rushed into the kitchen. Let John think she'd gotten a drink of water. For now, she didn't want to show her husband that she was aware of this ugly affair on the side. She didn't want to, or she just couldn't. She needed to digest the news, figure out how to proceed, realize after all what she really wants, and get used to the idea that John is not a reliable wall, behind which so cozy to hide from the hardships of life and the usual traitor. Outwardly, nothing has changed in the life of the family, but now Megan became more attentive. John's delays at work and his constant business trips were perceived quite differently. From time to time, while John was in the bathroom or out without his phone at the neighbors, Megan would look at his phone. Catherine texted John often. Some of the messages were quite explicit. They were usually accompanied by pictures of the girl. To give Catherine credit, she looked great. Judging by the state of her body, the girl spent long hours in the gym. From the correspondence, Megan realized that Catherine does not work and does not study. A typical kept woman. John was apparently willing to pay for it all. No, Megan knew that men just over 40 often pay attention to young nymphs. They probably feel younger, more energetic, stronger than their peers. And what is there to hide? 25-year-old friends are generally much more attractive than 40-year-olds, but the woman thought that her family would not be affected by this. She remembered the way John had looked at her, what he had said to her. He had genuinely loved Megan. Once upon a time, she had never doubted that. Could such feelings also grow cold with time? Catherine was no longer just a lover or a girl for occasional entertainment, who could be dumped at any time, swapped for another. John and his young lady's relationship was about 5 years old. Sometimes historical dates were glimpsed in their correspondence, and the oldest ones were around the time Vivian was born. Apparently, that was when they had met. Megan remembered that period of time after giving birth and with a newborn baby in her arms. She didn't feel very well. She probably looked even worse. Megan was completely focused on her health. She didn't even have the energy for her sons at the time. Thankfully, by the time they were born, her sisters had long since managed to become fully independent young men. Of course, Megan paid almost no attention to her husband because, as it seemed to her, there was no need. A grown man passionate about his work. But maybe that was where the mistake lay. Maybe she herself was to blame for what was happening to their family now. Megan shook her head and chased away the wrong thoughts. What was her fault? It was John, after all, who had decided to look for fun on the side. No would have supported his wife in her time of need, to take on some of the responsibilities, to take care of his spouse and newly born daughter. No, John chose another option. Catherine may not be his first mistress. John had been estranged for a long time, after all. Megan realized that clearly now. It's just that the woman preferred not to notice such trifles as distant alarm bells. He earns money, does everything for the family, does not drink, does not beat, does not humiliate. In money does not limit. Well and wonderful. What else is there to complain about? Megan wasn't complaining. She lived and enjoyed a happy, as it seemed to her, family life. And then suddenly it hit her. Maybe Catherine was not John's first mistress, but that it was with her he had a serious enough relationship, Megan did not doubt. John was truly in love with the girl. It could be felt in the tone of his messages. What only affectionate words he did not call his mistress. The man protected his lady from domestic, financial, and any other problems, gave her gifts, was constantly interested in her desire. It pained Megan to read this. Perhaps he had never behaved like that with her, even in the golden years of their marriage. It was understandable then. They were spinning, surviving, pulling children not to sentimentality. Megan realized that Catherine was getting on John's nerves about the divorce. Well, and when you already divorced your old lady, wrote the girl, supplying the message with red from anger emoticons. All in due time, baby. Answered John. I'd like more details. I'm in the process. A lot of things need to be prepared so that we can live not only happily but also richly. My princess loves a beautiful life. John's usually reserved and serious demeanor made Megan almost nauseous, but she continued to read the messages, looking for information about the upcoming divorce. She was more interested in this issue than any other, because it directly affected her and the children. Megan wasn't particularly worried about how her sons would take the divorce. They were adults and both of them had been living on their own for a long time. For them, most likely little will change. But the daughter, she is accustomed to this house and adores her father. Despite his indifference, the little girl would be very worried. Megan had no doubt about that, and something would have to be done about it. John's messages sometimes slipped in that he was taking his time with the divorce to properly prepare for leaving. What would that mean? The spouse was clearly up to something, and Megan wanted to find out what it was about. As far as her relationship with her spouse was concerned, nothing much had changed since Megan had found out about Catherine. Faking ignorance was easy. Megan and John hadn't spoken in a long time. Hey, how are you? How are the kids? That's all they talked about. And that's the life they've had for a long time. How come Megan didn't realize this before? I guess she was too busy with her daughter and her own worries and plans. She didn't tell Martha the details of her son's life, of course. She still came over sometimes to play with her granddaughter. There were times that Megan took and Vivian to her grandmother to go on business. But the relationship between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law never became warm and frank. Over the years, Megan had trusted Martha completely in everything about the baby. Perhaps it was the only person with whom the woman could leave her daughter with a light heart. But otherwise, over the years, Martha and Megan had remained largely strangers to each other. No, of course, Megan couldn't tell Martha about John, though she wanted to share it with someone. Why worry the older woman? Of course, she'd be upset to hear about her son's behavior. Will be worried it will negatively affect her health. Of course, the mother-in-law will still find out about the divorce, which of course she will. Even if John did not plan this procedure, Megan herself would have organized it, because cannot live with a traitor. That's how she perceived her husband now. If you're in love with someone else, say so. Why lie, why hide, why scheme? John never once scolded Catherine when she insulted Megan in her messages. And the old woman had called her both fat and stupid. John had at best ignored those unflattering remarks, at worst responded with laughing emoticons. It was hurtful. But Megan was much more interested in her husband's vague promises to divorce her as soon as everything was financially settled. The spouse was preparing something, some kind of scam, the results of which Megan was to be left with nothing. The man didn't write about it directly. It is understandable correspondence with his mistress had a completely different character, was light, humorous, in some places hot. But from some of the words and hints, Megan knew John was up to something. But how would she know what surprise to expect? Surely John and his mistress would discuss the details of the plan when they met. Megan, understandably, felt the whole situation hard. The pain of betrayal of a loved one, a vague future suspended state, all this frightened her, and there was no one to share it with. Had her mother been alive, how much easier would this trouble have been to bear? Megan slept badly, became nervous, pale and thin, irritable and withdrawn. Her physical condition even worsened, with headaches. One morning, as Megan was feeding her daughter breakfast, her mother-in-law called. "Are you home now?" Martha asked. "Yes," Megan answered. "John's at work, but my daughter and I are home." "Great, I'll be right there." Megan was overjoyed. "That's great. That means the mother-in-law can take care of her granddaughter. Meanwhile, she's going to go to the doctor. She's been having a lot of headaches. Have them prescribe some pills. I can't stand it anymore." Martha showed up as usual with a present for her granddaughter. A beautiful doll in a big pink box. The girl threw herself on her grandmother's neck. No, not because of the toy, of course, but there was just a special bond between Martha and Vivian. The grandmother and granddaughter seemed to understand each other without words. Megan had seen something like that before with her sons. Martha was a wonderful grandmother to all her children, sensitive, caring, attentive. It was surprising, considering her bossy, somewhat cold nature. Surprising, but wonderful. It's so nice to know that your children are so loved by someone other than you. "Good morning." Megan smiled at her mother-in-law. "It's so good to have you here. Vivian missed you." "I actually came to see you today." The smile that had been directed at her granddaughter slid off the older woman's face. She stared at her daughter-in-law. Megan immediately tensed, sensing that this was going to be a serious matter. "Go in the living room and watch cartoons." "Okay?" Megan turned to her daughter. She nodded her head and obediently slipped out of the room. She promised her mother and grandmother that they would join her soon to play with the new dolls. Martha and Megan were left alone in the kitchen. "What was that about? What did you want to talk to me about?" Megan asked. Martha didn't answer right away. It was obvious that she was having a hard time starting a conversation. Her mother-in-law sat down on a chair behind the counter that divides the kitchen into two parts. Megan sat across from her. "Do you know that John has been the only person near and dear to me for a long time?" Martha said at last. "Until the grandchildren came along and you." Megan nodded. Of course she knew that. Martha had been pulling her son along on her own, working all her life, making sure the child had everything she needed, and yet not basking in gold, but really raising John, always making time for him. When her husband talked about his childhood, Megan sometimes wondered where Martha, working at such a responsible high position, took the strength to do so much with the child. She went hiking with him and took him to museums, circuses, theaters, and every evening read books to him and checked his lessons and taught him everything around the house from cleaning and cooking to fixing the faucet. It's a tremendous amount of work. Megan realized this fully when she became a mother herself. "I tried to raise John to be a good person. Not only smart and successful, but also reliable and decent, not like his father. For a long time I thought I had succeeded, but the genes seemed to have taken their toll." Martha looked so sad at this point that Megan wanted to hug her, but the gesture wouldn't have been natural for them, so the woman held back. "I never told about John's father, not even to him. He asked, of course, especially when he was a teenager. I explained to him then that I really wanted a child. Age was pushing it, too. I didn't see any candidates for the role of father of the future baby around me. That's why I went to the resort that summer, to give myself a long-awaited gift. I lied to John then that I specifically made a resort romance there in order to give birth for myself. He wasn't the only one who thought so. By the way, I'd announced to everyone that my pregnancy was a conscious move, but it wasn't." Megan was silently catching every word. That frankness. Martha, it had never been so open. Martha was about 35 at the time, by today's standards a very young woman with everything ahead of her. Back then, she was considered an old maid. All deadlines for becoming a mother and wife had been missed. The train had left. Martha was not particularly worried about it. She devoted herself fully to her work. She had a responsible position, and there was always a lot to do. The woman liked to realize that she was such an important, indispensable person at the airport. She was respected, listened to, and even feared. Sometimes she regretted that she had not had a child and probably would not have one. But Martha didn't worry about that. She herself had grown up in an orphanage. She had seen so many unhappy fates and was not 100% sure that she could be a good mother and make her baby happy. That summer she was sent on a trip to the sea from the airport. Martha could afford to buy the tickets herself, but the union honored her as Employee of the Year. It's nice to be recognized and appreciated. The sanatorium turned out to be just wonderful. Comfortable room, sea in 5 minutes walk, wonderful dining room in walking distance. And there, in this sanatorium, Martha met her future father, John. It was a so-called business trip. A young guy about 10 years younger than Martha. He came from some northern town to work. It was Alex's first time at sea, and at first he looked a little dazed. It was even cute when Martha first noticed him in the dining room. The young man caught her eye immediately. He was good, really good, hair the color of ripe wheat, bright blue eyes. Those eyes would eventually play a key role in Martha's fate. He had amazing eyes, and I guess they were the reason I fell in love with him like a girl. I don't think I'd ever experienced anything like that even in my youth. Bottomless, bright blue, attentive. John inherited them. Richard and Stephen too, by the way. Alex had no idea he had a son and grandchildren, and that they had his eyes. Martha was now looking everywhere with her eyes for the handsome boy. At first she didn't understand why she did it, but he was a young man, so he was sure he would soon have no shortage of admirers like himself, young, lovely creatures. And so it was. For several days Martha watched from afar as Alex returned to the sanatorium with one and another beauty. All of them were just like a selection, slim, tanned, smiling. Alex smiled a lot himself. He had a wonderful smile. From it the guy had charming dimples on his cheeks. One day the young handsome man himself approached Martha. Alex confessed to me that he had been watching me for a long time. He's incredibly attracted to me. It was unexpected to hear that. A young, handsome guy, whom I had been admiring from afar for about a week, was giving me compliments that made my head spin. I was desperately jealous of all those young beauties with whom he appeared in the sanatorium. And he, it turns out, at the same time dreamed of me and did not dare to approach, did not dare, because he was afraid of rejection. According to him, I looked beautiful and inaccessible. Martha began a stormy resort romance. They walked a lot in the neighborhood, swam at night in the sea, laughed. Martha felt 10 to 15 years younger next to him. It seemed she had never laughed so much even in her youth. It's been a wonderful week. I fell in love. I just lost my head, which doesn't usually happen to me. It was so unlike me. Alex had me under a spell, and I didn't notice a lot of things, a lot of obvious things. Martha always paid for her companion in cafes, at the canteen, on excursions. He never gave her anything, she never expected it. Being around this guy was a gift in itself. Then one day Martha woke up in her room, expecting to see Alex next to her. They'd taken a long walk along the night promenade, gazing at the stars, talking about everything, and had fallen asleep with their arms around each other in the morning. Martha felt so happy and peaceful in the arms of her lover. But when she woke up, she didn't see Alex beside her. Martha stretched and rolled over onto her other side. She was still not alert for anything. This had happened before. Alex had probably just gone out for coffee and pastries to surprise her. How nice it was to have someone care for you like that. Martha dozed for another half an hour, enjoying the peace and quiet. But the longer she was alone, the more she realized something was wrong. Finally, the woman, unable to bear the anxiety any longer, got up, and then everything became clear. Alex's belongings were gone, not his clothes, not his favorite wristwatch. He'd even remembered to bring a little thing like perfume and a toothbrush. So Alex left while Martha was asleep. He left quietly, so as not to wake the woman and explain himself to her. Why was everything fine yesterday? A wave of longing and despair and resentment swept into Martha. It became difficult to breathe. She wandered around the room and could not find a place to go. Her heart clenched with unbearable pain. Martha thought she had found her soulmate. Alex had been so easy for her, so pleasant. Even though he was much younger, Martha felt supported by him. Nothing had foreshadowed this outcome. Just last night, Alex had hugged her tightly, showering her with kisses and compliments. He was seriously planning a future together. The guy lived in a small town in the north. He even called Martha to go there, and she was ready to give up her career, apartment, friends, everything, just to be near him. In desperation, Martha opened her closets again and again. Maybe Alex had just moved his things? What about himself? Maybe he was late for some reason. but Alex's clothes were nowhere to be found. Martha noticed some of her own things were missing. A box of gold jewelry. Martha had taken a small part of her tame jewelry on vacation, but they were her favorite 2 pairs of earrings, a dainty chain, and a bracelet with small sapphires. Original, exquisite pieces that you couldn't buy in every store. Martha's bracelet was imported from Germany. Now this jewelry box has disappeared. There was no half-empty bottle of Chanel No. 5 on the shelf in the bathroom. In the safe closet, the woman was missing 3-year-old dresses, which she bought when she was on vacation in Riga. Her heart clenched with a bad feeling. So is Alex just a criminal? I should probably write a report to the police. On the other hand, it was shameful to have to confess to strangers that she had lost her head in the arms of a young traitor and trusted him blindly. And a grown woman boss. Even Martha sat down on the sofa, hugged herself tightly, and began to sway. That's what she used to do when she was just a little girl. Martha had grown up in an orphanage. There you couldn't get comfort and sympathy from adults. So the girl got into the habit of hugging herself when she became an adult. Martha somehow outgrew this ritual, and in a moment of stress and despair, the habit returned. It was necessary to leave the stuffy room and take a walk along the shore. The fresh sea breeze would give strength and bring relief. Martha walked to the front door and noticed a note. Alex had left her some kind of message on the mirror. The heart glad for 3 fed a faint hope that everything would still be fine. Maybe the young man is just preparing some kind of surprise. And here she almost went crazy with worry. But the miracle didn't happen. Alex did run away, only for some reason it was important for him to explain his behavior to Martha. You've probably figured it out by now. Are you crying? You look at me, scolding yourself for being so gullible. I don't know why I'm writing all this. Usually I just leave. But you're really special. I can't do what I do to others. I really like you. You're strong and noble. You're also really beautiful. Probably any man would be happy with you on. But not me. I realized a long time ago that my happiness is different from the idea of a prosperous life of most people. I like adventure, a change of location, meeting new people. I realized long ago that I can never be with one single woman. Family, children. Everyday life is not for me. That's the way I was born. My mother says I took after my father. I never knew him, by the way. He's also a vagabond, an adventurer. Probably this man does not even know of my existence. It doesn't matter. Of course I haven't told you a word of the truth. Well, almost know the fact that you are very beautiful, smart, strong. I really think so. Those words of mine were sincere. As for my biography, I named the wrong city. I lied about my age. My name isn't even Alex. That's my favorite part of making up a cover story, pretending to be someone else. Some people think of me as a young actor, some as a talented young engineer. It all depends on the inspiration. Sometimes it comes to me and I compose a story about a tragic fate. It is fascinating, interesting, exciting. And women like it. I know how to make them happy, even if only for a short time. Those burning eyes of yours, those admiring glances. I make the gray, everyday life of single ladies bright, colorful, magical. And for all this in life, you have to pay. That's why I charge a small fee for happy weeks and days. You have to admit, it's only fair. Our week was one of the happiest weeks of your life, wasn't it? I'm moving on. New adventures, new stories. And you? No offense. You're really special to me. I usually leave in silence, I don't leave notes. But I wanted to explain myself to you. Martha hurried on, staring at the piece of paper, the reading hard to fit in her head. Alex, who isn't even Alex, is a professional Alfonso, living off women, flitting through life like a careless moth. He plays different roles and enjoys it. Most likely we are talking about some kind of special mental disorder. But a normal person can't live like that. Strangest of all, after reading the note, Martha agreed with Alex. The guy was right. This week was really the brightest and happiest in her life. Martha decided to keep this story in the depths of her memory, sometimes to come back to it again, to feel those bright, positive emotions that Alex gave her. But it turned out differently. When Martha returned from vacation, she realized that she was expecting a child. I realized that it was Alex's child, a man who was probably not quite mentally healthy, but I decided to keep it because, first of all, I was tired of being all alone, And secondly, probably I still loved Alex. Or rather, the image that that young man had created. At the due date, a wonderful, healthy, and strong boy was born. He had Alex's eyes. Martha had noticed that back in the hospital. The handsome, charming baby inherited other features of his father's appearance. He bore little resemblance to Martha. The woman prayed that the son's resemblance to Alexei would be limited to external features. Martha, knowing about the genes inherited by John, therefore paid special attention to the upbringing of her son. She developed responsibility, honesty, and kindness in him, and John seemed to grow up to be a wonderful guy. Martha anxiously searched for the traits of a reckless adventurer, as his father was, but did not find them. John faithfully did his homework, never skipped classes at school, and then at the university. When the boy grew up, Martha watched his relationships with girls with bated breath. But even here, John did not resemble Alex. Before Megan, the guy dated a former classmate. They were a couple for several years in a row. No torrid short-term affairs. When her son married Kay Megan, Martha exhaled, "It's okay. John has a beautiful wife, great kids, his own business. No, the son is nothing like the character of a careless Alfonso father. It was a success, but it turned out I'd been too early." Martha shook her head. "Now I'm going to have to tell you the bitter and ugly truth about John. I kept silent while it was none of my business, went through everything inside me. But now the welfare of my grandchildren is at stake. I can't let them be left with nothing." Megan realized what she was about to talk about. To make it easier for her mother-in-law, she spoke up. "I know he's cheating on me. John has a young mistress. I've seen them together and even read the sweet couple's correspondence." "Really?" Martha's eyebrows rose in surprise. "And why didn't you scandalize him? How did you even survive it?" "I'm just at a loss," Megan admitted. Having someone to talk to made her feel better. Yes, it was John's mother. But Megan sensed that she was completely on her side. "I see." Martha nodded. "Anybody would be confused. So you know about this, Catherine?" Megan nodded, then asked, "But how did you know about it?" "John told me," Martha said. "He said he'd been unhappily married for a long time. That you, as his wife, didn't pay any attention to him. You'd lost yourself in the children and the house, become uninterested and indifferent. The usual male excuses." It was painful to realize that the only child in which so much invested in is capable of such a thing. Apparently, the genes still took their toll. Though not immediately, Megan could barely hold back her tears. But maybe he's right. I did have a lot to do with the kids in the house. Maybe John really did lack attention. I wish we had talked about it in time." "He's wrong," Martha said flatly. "There's more to it than that. Sometimes the feeling goes away. It happens, and it's normal, but this is different. John is lying to you, cheating on you, and that's the worst part. He and Catherine are going to leave you with nothing. You and the kids." "How?" Megan gasped. She was used to the idea of John cheating on her, and here was a new shock. It seemed to her that her husband adored children and would do anything to provide them with a happy future. And now this. Although these hints about preparing for divorce, this is their plan. "It's sad," Martha shook her head. "When I heard him, I wanted to give up the plan and my son right away. But then I decided to keep my emotions to myself. If I didn't agree, they'd think of something else." John felt like a happy man. He had achieved a lot in life, built a whole mini-empire, organized a network of plumbing stores. The man had a right to be proud of himself. His family life up to now, everything suited him: a beautiful wife, wonderful children, well-adjusted life. It was a kind of quest to get for the family funds, buy a new car, change the apartment to a large house. And then these tasks somehow ceased to fascinate and bring joy. It became too easy. John no longer needed money. They were enough for new acquisitions, and for traveling, and for children's education. The man suddenly got bored, and then just at this very moment, in his life appeared Catherine, young and energetic, loving adventures and adventures. She worked as a saleswoman in one of his stores. One evening, John stopped by the store to talk to the accountant, but the woman was no longer at work. Behind the counter, however, stood a new saleswoman, incredibly beautiful. "She's openly flirting with the boss." But how can you resist? No, at first John resisted his feelings. His mother from childhood brought up in him responsibility, hammered into his head the true values of the family, so it was difficult for a man to make this step. But when it happened, John realized that all these years he had lived in the captivity of his own attitudes. With Catherine, John felt young and energetic again. She was as adventurous and capable of abnormal behavior as he was. Existence without this girl now seemed to John bland and boring. So it went on for several years. Feelings did not subside, on the contrary, flared up with renewed vigor. John was literally bewitched by his young, beautiful mistress. He did not want to part with her for a moment, but every or almost every evening he had to return to the boring Megan. The very atmosphere of the house, once warm and cozy, was weighing on John. He felt like he was in a prison. The lovers talked more and more about John needing to divorce Megan. It was a done deal. True, both of them did not want one thing: that half of all the property accumulated during the years of marriage passed into the ownership of the legal spouse. She wasn't working, was she? Catherine was indignant. She sat at home, cooking borscht, relaxing, watching soap operas while you worked. In justice, all property should belong to you and only you. That's true, John sighed. But the law is the law. Megan will be given half of the property acquired during the marriage. But isn't there a loophole in those laws? You're in a position to hire a good lawyer to figure something out. And one day there was a loophole. It was simple and complicated at the same time. It was suggested by a lawyer who was familiar with such issues. "I have already had such cases in practice," said a man in a stylish suit. "You need to sign over all the property to a person you trust. And your wife should trust him too. Maybe a close friend or relative. My clients explain this to spouses to preserve assets in case of business problems. Everyone has their own theory, and then you can initiate divorce proceedings. There is no property, there is nothing to divide, and the trusted person, after everything, just rewrites houses, apartments, cars on the already divorced spouse. That is, on you. That's it." John thought for a long time. After this conversation, he had only one candidate for the role of such a trustee: his mother. Megan would easily agree to sign over all the property to her. She trusts her mother-in-law, but how to go to her mother with such a request? She would have to confess everything to her, and yet there was no other way. John decided to have a serious conversation. He realized his mother would not be happy about the situation. But she's his mother, she will support her son and help him. It was a shame to give Megan half of what he earned. Especially since Megan did not work, lived a quiet and relaxed life. What right does she have to all this? Martha listened to her son in silence, not interrupting. As always, she looked unperturbed and somewhat detached. The only thing that betrayed the older woman's anxiety was her fingers, which tugged relentlessly at the long sleeve of her sweater. "Have you made up your mind?" Martha asked when her son had finished. Yes, he nodded. "Ooh. Don't you feel sorry for Megan?" "I've fallen out of love with her. She's clearly indifferent to me. What are we going to do? Spend the rest of our lives together? What about assets? She hasn't invested a dime in the house or anything else. So that's fair. I was the only one working. She provided for you," Martha reminded me. "And she raised your children. Thanks to Karina, you could think of nothing else but the development of the business. She always took care of the rest. And remember Megan, at first, she helped you a lot. Doing those reports at night, doing those estimates. That's when you got a staff of accountants." "You're exaggerating, Mom. You're exaggerating what she did." "All right, and the children?" It was obvious that Marta was struggling to keep it together. "What about the children? Am I going to pay child support for them? That's how I'll help them. So you'll help me?" After a short silence, Martha nodded her head. John could see in her eyes that her mother didn't approve of what he was doing. Well, he hadn't expected anything else. The important thing was that she agreed. John signed over all the property to Martha. Megan did not suspect anything. She immediately believed in the fairy tale that John, in this way, just avoid unnecessary risks. Megan hadn't been paying much attention to anything lately. All her time and attention was devoted to her young daughter. Well, all the better. Catherine was as excited as a child. You bet, because everything was going so smoothly. without a hitch. It seemed to open up a happy, carefree future ahead. Catherine and John planned to celebrate their success with a trip to the sea. They had already chosen a resort, even argued a little about it. One day, when all the property was already rewritten to Martha, John dared to have a frank conversation with Megan. The man, of course, was worried. All the same to inform the person with whom he lived so many years, such news, not very pleasant. But Megan took it all surprisingly calmly. Naive woman, apparently has not yet realized that she will not get anything in the divorce. She wouldn't find out until the courtroom, and even if she finds out sooner, there's nothing she can do about it. John officially moved into the apartment he'd rented for Catherine. Now it was just the two of them, waiting for the court hearing after which Megan would have to leave home. In the very apartment where they lived before John succeeded, on the street, the ex-wife and daughter will not stay. And the boys, they're already living in another city. Independent young men. You don't have to worry about them at all. And now, finally, the day has come. John and Catherine have waited so long for this date. Today, at last, it will be over. John will get freedom. A little later, will sign everything from his mother to himself, and the sweet couple will fly to the beach with white soft sand. Catherine decided to go to the meeting with her beloved. She wore an elegant suit, emphasizing the advantages of her luxurious figure, made light makeup, let her hair down. John once again admired the beautiful beloved. Yes, she looked like a supermodel from the cover of a magazine. In his youth, John had never dreamed of such girls, and here he was, a stunning beauty in love with him. In the conference room, John noticed Megan at once. She looked surprisingly calm and dignified. For some reason, Martha was sitting next to her, wearing the suit she had worn as an airport employee on the days when she needed luck. His mother's presence confused John. He wondered why she was here. She's sitting next to Megan. Come to support her sister-in-law. Odd, considering their plan. Catherine tensed at the sight of her future mother-in-law. She disliked Martha. She realized that the older woman was not happy that the young girl had broken up her son's tight-knit family. So what? What did her opinion matter? Absolutely none, she thought. Martha greeted her son and his companion with a nod of her head. Megan, on the other hand, said hello loud and friendly, even smiled. The hearing began. The judge read the divorce decree, determined the place of residence of the minor daughter with her mother, and announced the amount of alimony that must now be paid monthly on Vivian John. And then it came to the most important thing of all, property. Since you don't share any property, there is nothing to divide, the judge concluded. The wife's marital home remains hers. In general, that's not all. What about the gift? Martha spoke from her seat. As for your gift, it's not a subject for a court of law. What gift deed? John jumped up, his heart clenched with misgivings. Catherine, sitting next to him, smiled happily. She did not suspect anything yet. A deed of gift for all your family's property, which I made out to Megan, Martha replied, looking pointedly at her son, Megan, and the grandchildren. What did you think? I'm going to leave them on the street with nothing, so you can have a nice life while they all live in a cramped apartment. John's eyes blurred. Such a man did not expect such a mother. He looked at Catherine, beautiful face. The girl skewed. There was an evil grimace. She opened and closed her mouth in surprise. She tried to say something, but not a single word escaped her tongue. She even seemed to be out of breath. Megan looked calm and peaceful. The judge read out some more formalities regarding the divorce. Martha was whispering about something with her sister-in-law, and it was slowly dawning on John that it was over. Of course, Catherine would leave him now. She would not stay with him through the hard times. That's for sure. She would have to start all over again. All over again.